Welcome to the hearing stream 4 for the Napier City Proposed District Plan. The hearing today will hear submissions on a number of chapters actually. The chapters relating to the centres and mixed use zones, the residential zones and some of the amenity precincts related to those zones, and also to noise as well. So welcome everybody to the hearing. The hearing panel for this stream is Rob van Voorthausen to my left and Haley Brown on my right. We have the full suite of reporting officers here on my right here. We are being live streamed and recorded, so that will make people able to go back and listen to the hearing quite easily. So the program it's a 2-day program, or we're really 1.5 now. We will hear from the reporting officers who will talk to their opening statements very shortly. And then we will go to the submitters today. It's a full day today, and as I said, tomorrow's half a day. We have read all of the submissions, and we are proposing to do one site visit in relation to noise on Tuesday afternoon. Apart from that, we are here ready to hear from the officers. So without any further ado, I'll turn to the officers. Who's first on the list today? You are. Hey, Connie, thanks.
Good morning. Hello again. My name's Connie Mills. I'm employed as Strategic Planning Lead within Napier City Council's City Development team. My qualifications include a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Planning. I wrote the S42 report for noise. I did not prepare the chapter, but I have considered the submissions and further submissions. I've also got Mr. John Stiles here today. He's Council's Technical Advising Officer for Noise.
Good morning.
So the noise provisions consider few parts of the proposed district plan. It's the noise chapter, the definitions relating to noise, planning maps relating to noise, and appendices 5A to C. I'm really sorry about the further addendums needed to support the noise chapter. So we've got the primary report, the section 42 report, addendum 1 and addendum 2. I'm also working on an updated appendix A to consolidate all the recommended changes across those 3 addendums and my opening statement. That should be available tomorrow afternoon. So overview of noise, there was over 400 submission points and further submission points in relation to noise. It drew quite a lot of attention. The recommendation report is separated into key themes. We've got noise generated from infrastructure, noise in urban environments, noise in rural environments, special activity noise, and then miscellaneous provisions. The key issues of my opinion, that are still in contention with the noise provisions are airport noise in relation to reverse sensitivity on residential areas, port noise management methods and reporting requirements, the acoustic insulation and ventilation requirements, and it's in relation to quite a suite of things across the noise chapter. So we've got the airport, port, rural production noise, which is a new issue, railway lines and state highways, and helicopter noise. There were quite a few changes throughout the 42A and addendums. These are tracked in Appendix A. To summarise the core changes, there was a huge amount of improvements to flow and clarity throughout the noise chapter and the way that compliance is determined. So it was a bit of a swap around. Instead of having some rules and some standards, I shifted everything into a standard level compliance that related back to a rule, and that's just a consistency factor. We opted to take a far more strengthened protection for rural noise generating activities and noise generating activities in highly productive rural environments. And this introduced more policy direction that we do want to protect our productive areas for the purpose of production activities. We improved cohesion across temporary noise activities, stadium zone, and the noise chapter. These have been explored in hearing stream 2, 3, and now 4, and we think there's still some further tweaking that we can do to improve cohesion. There was also quite a change on enabling the Miani Speedway to continue operating based on their current racing levels and practice schedules. We considered that the notified provisions perhaps took a far too conservative approach. So since publishing my Noise 42 report and all the addendums with it, I have also recommended some further changes. Firstly, to provision S5, which is acoustic treatment for activities sensitive to aircraft activities inside the outer control boundary. This is all to do with the Hawke's Bay Airport and sensitive activities and the ventilation methods for it. Since publishing the report, we've been in discussion with the Napier City Council Commercial Director and have lent back into the relief sought by Hawke's Bay Airport. And it's just to manage the methods of demonstrating that you've got a compliant indoor environment and not creating undue costs for acoustic reporting unless it's a triggered standard. Further to this, we looked at Hawke's Bay Airport's noise evidence and really did agree that there is merit in discouraging any further sensitive activities in non-residential zones. I think there is recognition that we've got an existing urban environment and that can't be avoided, and the Napier City Council approach to the existing urban environment is to manage noise effects, not avoid, but we have seen the merit in the airport's position that in the rural zones or non-residential zones that we should really be strong and not introduce any new noise-sensitive activities. I disagreed that we needed to make it prohibitive. I thought non-complying is a far more appropriate status there. I think in the odd occasion there might be the opportunity for sensitive activities, provided they're well managed. We also remained of the opinion that retaining the air noise boundary alongside the outer noise boundary was preferable, and that assisted us in the compliance of the noise provisions, and I wonder if John Stiles could talk to that further. I really took his advice on that point. And then I also made an error in trying to recommend accepting relief on the port noise mitigation requirements, but that error accidentally created direction that I didn't mean to recommend, and that was to do with the offering of acoustic remedy for those houses in the 55 to 60 noise contour. I didn't mean to recommend it be mandatory. I thought it should be an option to be considered. So there was some pre-hearing meetings. There were no formal pre-hearing meetings, but there has been some pre-hearing correspondence, and that's been outlined in the officer's statement. I've read most of the pre-circulated evidence. I don't have any further comments to make, but would take direction from the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to kick off questions, where do you think the key differences lie between yourself and submitters at the moment? Because there has been quite a bit of movement towards accepting or recommending accepting submitters' points, but where at the moment do you think the key divergences are?
Yeah, so I'd say we could probably separate the noise thoughts into like infrastructure providers and then community perspective. I do think that there is room on the infrastructure provided relief sought to discuss those a bit more. I mean, I don't think anything that we put together is perfect. And that's more insofar as probably the NZTA noise boundary with where it lays. Like at the moment we've got 100 metres, perhaps it could be a modelled level. We've got some movement on the port's ability to achieve a compliant noise outcome. We don't want to limit their growth or limit their operations, but we also want to recognise that they are adjoining a residential environment. So I think there's some give and take there. I think what we've put together in the 42 and addendums have recognised NCC's ability to probably flex a little bit more in favour of the infrastructure providers and perhaps the notified provisions. Very wishy-washy, sorry.
That's right, and Kiwi Rail?
So I think Kiwi Rail and Wakakuta had a very similar noise approach. The exception was Kiwi Rail has been seeking a vibration alert overlay. I didn't think that there was enough evidence in the submission to support that at this time, but I think if there's further evidence, for sure, to entertain the conversation.
I will alert you to the fact that I will be questioning the sort of evidence base for the railway line rules and controls, because To me, there's not a lot of evidence to support the reasoning for that, as opposed to, say, road traffic. So I will be asking questions around that, and presumably my commissioners too. I'm going to ask Mr. Stiles shortly to just explain the key differences at the moment from a technical perspectives from his advice from submitters, his advisors for that. But before I do that, just turn to any questions from the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Got a number of questions, both from the opening statement and from addendum number 2. Is it appropriate we take addendum number 2 questions as well? I'll start with the opening, just in your page 3. Is the Napier City Commercial Director a submitter?
Yes, they are. I think we probably referred to them inconsistently throughout our 42 report.
Yeah.
It sometimes was considered Parkland's resident Parkland's, yeah. And then sometimes they've been called commercial director.
Okay.
So I can find the submitter number if that's an easier reference.
Yeah, that'd be helpful, thanks. And in terms of your recommend amendments to S5 in the opening, have you liaised with Hawke's Bay Airport Limited witnesses regarding those changes?
No, but it was their relief sought.
Okay. And just turning to the part of the opening that deals with P7. So that's on page 5. I was just wondering, do we need to think about, you say they discourage new noise-sensitive activities within non-residential zones. The ERPZ zone is a non-residential zone, but we wouldn't necessarily want to discourage noise-sensitive activities within the airport zone buildings and area, would we?
No, that's probably a really good point, and something that could be amended into P7.
Yep, okay. And can you just remind me on page 6, because I can't remember, what is Section 25 Survey Office Plan 3286 record of title? What is that? Where is it? What is it?
Oh, I'd have to look it up. I don't want to, there's 2 spots that I've looked at, sorry.
Right. Okay, if you can come back to that. It's quite unusual to have such a specific reference in a district plan policy, in my experience. So it'd be helpful to know what that is, and if there's some better way of describing it. I don't know if there is or not.
Could I get it to you at the morning tea break today? It wouldn't take long.
Yeah, there's no rush on that. You can just address it in your reply. It's just a clarification point. So now I just want to turn to your addendum number 2.
Sorry, could I, one moment, I'll just pop that one up.
Yeah,
thank you.
and the numbering, the paragraph numbering's a bit skew if it jumps all over the place, so I'm going to refer to page numbers as well. So page 5, paragraph 30.
Perfect, yep.
Look, I'm not sure if your suggested recommendation to amend the provisions as outlined there in the red font actually works. I think you've conflated two kind of principles. We have the noise-sensitive activities and we have the noise-sensitive space. The actual noise-sensitive activities are the activities listed in A. And noise-sensitive spaces occur within those activities, but the way you've reworded it, the noise-sensitive activity would be purported to be the noise-sensitive space. You see, you've kind of reversed the order of them. I see the noise-sensitive space being a subset of the activity, but your rewording reverses that order. And I haven't seen that kind of definition in other district plans, so maybe you give that some more thought. It might be safer just to leave it as it was.
Okay.
But that's for you to think about.
Thank you.
And just on a minor point, in A, we have retirement accommodation. I think we've had recommendations from other reporting officers to change that wording to retirement village instead of retirement accommodation. So it's just an internal consistency issue. And just turning the page, top of page 6. You've referred there specifically in the red font to activities sensitive to aircraft noise. Should we also include activities sensitive to port noise, since it's district-wide provision?
Be a good idea.
Yeah, I just keep on turning the pages. So I'm now at the top of page 7, page 7, which is paragraph 29. Now, in my view, the second part of that definition, if you go to the third line and see the words that start new buildings and alterations to habitable rooms, that's not actually a definition, that's a policy directive. So you've included what I think is a policy direction inside the definition, which is not appropriate. So I think the definition itself is the first 3.5 lines, and the rest of it is actually a policy direction which needs to sit somewhere else if it's to be retained. You shouldn't have policy direction within a definition. The definition just needs to be standalone as a definition. Top of page 10, paragraph 48. Now, this issue of the air noise boundary and the out of control boundary, you refer to the evidence of Mr Stiles, which is appropriate. Have you considered all the other noise experts, including Mr Jack Peckle and his advice?
I've leant more into John
No,
Stiles.
but as an evaluative witness, have you considered the full range of expert noise evidence for us?
Yeah, I've read it through, but I've definitely opted for the perspective offered by Mr John Stiles.
Yeah, and what was the reason for that?
I'm not a noise expert, so leaning into our noise expert.
Right. So did you consider Mr Stiles' evidence was more appropriate, or you favoured him because he was the council's noise expert?
The latter?
All right, that was all just a few matters I wanted to ask you about. Thank you.
Commissioner Brown?
I think I'll hold my questions for now. Do that later.
Okay, I've just got a few, just to follow up Commissioner Van Voorthousen's. The use of the term short-term visitor accommodation in relation to aircraft noise, there's no definition of it, and I'm just wondering whether a consent planner in the future would know what short-term visitor accommodation meant as opposed to visitor accommodation.
I think it's a really good point. In the opening statement, we recommended introducing it as up to 2 nights stay for short term. Because it only related to that role, we didn't see a full definition needed, so we just provided clarification in the role.
Okay, thank you. The other thing too is I'm not totally clear on the reasoning, and mainly because there's so much detail, around the need for 3 different noise-sensitive activity terms. So we've got noise-sensitive activity, then we've got those aircraft, sensitive to aircraft noise, and then with port noise. What is the reasoning for having those? Are they used quite differently, or could you use noise-sensitive activity, but pertaining to 2 particular noise sources? So, like in the aircraft noise ones, could you not say noise-sensitive activities in the aircraft noise or whatever? I'm just wondering why there's a reason for using 3 different terms for what is basically the same activity, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I wonder if I could take some time to consolidate the 3 through the Office of Reply.
Okay, thank you. Probably I'll turn to Mr Stiles if he doesn't mind, if I haven't put him on the spot, just to sort of outline where you think the key divergences. Again, this is a follow-up to Commissioner Van Voorthousen's question around the expert noise opinions, where the key divergences occur between yourself and those from the Smithers, particularly noise in aircraft.
Sure.
Port noise.
I don't have a full list, but I'll do my best to go off the top of my head and from everything I've been reading. On the airport matters, I think there's only really two main issues. The first is whether or not the air noise boundary is retained. The airport is seeking to delete it. I still don't really see any acoustic reason for that. The air noise boundary is promoted in New Zealand Standard 6805 as a key tool for managing the interface between the airport and whatever is outside it out to the OCV. I think that's really important. My understanding is that there will be, some land use intensification and commercial and industrial activities are going to be proposed for land around the airport in another hearing process. And so that reinforces my view that that air noise boundary is important. Right at the end of his evidence, Mr. Peakle discusses what he considers should happen if it's retained, and the most important thing is that it's cadastralised to the outside of the airport land holdings in the airport zone, and I absolutely agree with that. I think it should be retained and cadastralised to the airport land holdings or zone, whichever is the greatest, if you like. And then there's a couple of spots where the air noise boundary goes outside of both of those because it's a predicted noise contour. And so where it goes outside of the airport zone or the airport's land holdings, then it should follow the predicted contour that Mr. Peakle's got in his evidence and that's in the notified plan provisions already. I think he will talk to you about that probably in a bit of detail, and it might be best at that time. He might have a map that will show what we're talking about a bit clearer. But in summary, I think it should be retained. That's one major difference we've got with the airport. And if it is retained, then I agree with Mr. Peakle that it needs to be cadastralised. The other point in the evidence that Ms. Mills has already covered with the airport is these, or discouraging residential dwellings in the rural production zone. I think there are 5 lots. Ms. Mills has already talked to you briefly about that and proposed some changes to it to give relief to that part of the airport's evidence, and I agree with that. So there is a part of the outer control boundary which just covers some rural production properties. Mr. Peakle's view is that residential should be discouraged out of those areas, and I agree. That's a very simple point, I think.
By discourage, do you mean prohibit or some other consent status?
That's
Quite a big difference there.
yeah, absolutely. Probably getting out of my lane a little bit. My understanding is that prohibited's pretty strong and there'd be no case possible for it. It's definitely a planning matter, but I would have thought that non-complying could be made to be strong enough. But I defer to the planners and Ms. Mills on that and yourselves.
No, because that was a line of questioning and I had, because I can imagine for a rural production zone, where you put your house is quite important in relation to how you manage your property and farm it productively. And it may be that the best place for a house is within the outer control noise boundary. And I'm saying so we seeking a rule that would prevent that from happening, or even being considered in terms of what could be done to mitigate the noise, in terms of acoustic insulation and the like. So that was a line of questioning I was going to follow.
There's certainly I'm not aware of any standards or direction that would require a prohibited status. For example, the chapter provisions talk about activities sensitive to noise being possible through a consent pathway, provided you acoustically treat them. That's what New Zealand Standard 6805 recommends as well. So it's reasonably strong, but it's certainly not prohibited. It's a long way from prohibited.
Thank you. That's in terms of the airport. Were there any other technical divergences?
No, in terms of noise. There was one other. Engine testing. in the evidence, Mr. Peakle and Ms. O'Sullivan talk about engine testing. They say that there is no planned engine testing in Napier. There is only emergency engine testing. And so there is still some minor disagreement about how those should be provided for. In my view, if there is no planned engine testing, then we shouldn't be crafting a rule to provide for it. If there is none, there is none. Emergency engine testing should be provided for. I think this overlaps a lot into the designation conditions as well, but it may come up today.
So, in your opinion, if engine testing is proposed, then it should be done by way of a plan change to specifically address that activity?
I think it would have to be now, yeah,
Right.
because we'd need information on how noisy it is, how often it might happen, these sorts of things, which is not before us. It hasn't been a part of the discussion so far. But as I read the evidence, it is not proposed. Planned engine testing is just not proposed. So I think we can just put a line through it. We don't need it.
Thank you for that.
In terms of port noise, so I was engaged by the council in 2022 to start discussions with the port and review the provisions in their noise management plan and their noise predictions, updated noise control boundaries. Excuse me. A lot of water went under the bridge on those issues, and there was a lot of work between myself and Mr. Fitzgerald, who's going to present to you today. He alludes to that in his evidence as well, and it was very productive. We tested a lot of assumptions, and I came to the view that I'm quite happy with the modelling. There were some minor changes made to the modelling, but I'm quite happy with that. I think it's done quite well. And as I read the evidence, it's the port are quite happy, I think. There's only a few minor differences on the way the monitoring and acoustic mitigation funding provisions should be worded, including dollar amounts and per dwelling, and that's a bit out of my wheelhouse, so I stay out of that a little. But the differences are very minor, so I'm quite pleased with the progress on that whole topic. It's been very good. On rail, on the vibration alert layer, I think it might be helpful if we talk about the wider context on this issue. Typically, KiwiRail, or had been certainly in the past, looking for compliance with vibration standards and controls. So if you were building a house close to the railway line, you would have to make sure that the vibration level indoors was less than a certain value. I really have been opposed to that in various plan processes across the country because of the cost. It's significant. For a single level dwelling, it would be in the order of $100,000. Multi-level dwellings, I don't know anyone that's done one. It would be large sums of money to achieve. And when you think about, for most parts of the railway network anyway, the fact that the number of movements is quite low, especially relative to the international context, there just wasn't enough evidence really to justify a strict vibration control requiring isolation of houses and all these really tricky technical engineering methods. So probably in the last year or two, KiwiRail have essentially dialed back that position a little bit and now seeking a vibration alert overlay, which is just a layer on the plan that provides, it's an information layer essentially, an alert to incoming property owners that there could be vibration from time to time. I support that and have done across the country in other processes. I think it's a helpful provision. I think, in my view, it's better than nothing. and it's certainly better than strict engineering-based controls. Based on my experience over the last 20-odd years, I think it would help to filter out people that identify as being potentially sensitive to vibration. And that's the basis upon which I support it.
Right.
It definitely won't work in every case, I'm sure. But based on the emails and phone calls and things that our office sometimes receive about when people are moving into these situations and they see these layers and covenants and things on their titles, and they ask what they're about, and we can explain to them, sometimes they say, well, okay, thank you for that, I'm going to look somewhere else, I don't want to live there. So that may help. On to the highland or the state highway noise part of the highland transport noise overlay. There's no fundamental differences between the council and NZTA, as I read it. Mr. Lindenberg from Kaingaora and his evidence talks about the fact that the extent of that overlay should be a computer noise modelled contour that takes into account topography and buildings and these sorts of things. I agree with Mr. Lindenberg that should be the case. And the only reason I guess it's not there, especially in the notified provisions, was that they were all prepared before NZTA had published its state highway noise contour maps. So there's been some time between all these things happening. But now that those published contours are available, they're available on the internet, I think that the extent of the overlay should be that modelled contour. And that has been the case and has been made operative in a number of other plan reviews in the last probably 2 years around the country.
Can we just have a follow-up question
Sure.
on that one?
Thank you for that. Just wondering about the longevity of a process like that. 'Cause, you know, if you chop down a significant tree, it changes the contour. How does that fit in with it in being embedded in a document that has a 10-year outlook?
Yep, absolutely. These are some of the issues that we've covered quite a lot. Fortunately, trees don't reduce noise much, so we don't have to worry about those, but it is relevant to changes in landform and buildings. So a significant building next to the state highway will screen noise, and so the contour and the extent of the overlay might tuck in behind it. So if you're behind that building, you don't have to do anything. But if that building was demolished and turned into a yard or some open space or smaller buildings, then the noise effects might be great enough to actually warrant, acoustic treatment in that dwelling that would have been behind the building. So in the life of the plan, if the larger buildings are demolished or changed in a way that reduces their screening effect, then you could end up with the same problem. The conversations that I've had, certainly with NZTA around these issues, are that it's a known, I guess, issue with these provisions, and it's able to be reviewed every 10 years. Buildings typically last quite some time. So the likelihood of it becoming an issue in any given location over a 10-year period is probably low. It will happen, of course, because these buildings will be demolished at some point. But I don't think it's going to cause major problems. The trade would be, or the opposite argument would be, if you leave the contour at 100 metres, so it would include buildings, new houses behind those big screening buildings, then they would have to be acoustically treated, even though there's not enough noise to justify it. And that might, well, that's inefficient, and it may be inefficient for some time because those buildings doing the screening might be there for 20 years, maybe 30, we don't know. So it depends where you want the efficiency to lie, really. I think that given the majority of the screening comes down to landform, which is far less likely to be changed than buildings, I think it's a better outcome to have the modelled contour.
Thank you. Just turning to the state highway corridors, what are the key differences in terms of the spatial extent of the corridors as opposed to what was notified as opposed to the modelled contours? Are they wider or narrower, generally speaking?
They're never wider, so the modelled contour stops at 100 metres. So where there is a change, it will always be narrower. Yep.
And in terms of the rail corridor, in terms of the noise aspect rather than vibration as such, what's your viewpoint at the moment?
That's a tricky one. And other processes, I know I'm relying on other processes a lot, but I wouldn't want to have all the same discussions with the Kiwi Rail and NZTA every time there's a plan change, because they are long discussions and there's a lot of paperwork for you to consider. So we do lean on those other processes, but to because they've flushed out a lot of the answers to these problems. As I understand it, Kiwi Rail don't have noise modelling for their rail corridor. And so there's no real ability to adopt a model contour because it doesn't exist. It would be work that would have to be done, and it's for an entire district, it would be quite a bit of work to do. So their provisions are based on a standard distance, which I think is the best we can do in this case. And they're a little bit different in that they are based on a 1 hour noise level. So you don't need, you only really need 2 trains in 1 hour to start controlling that noise level and that effect and justifying that control, especially if they're at night, which I understand is absolutely possible in Napier with the port. There are some, again, there's been some time lapse between when these provisions were notified and now. There are some technical refinements to the rules that we could incorporate. I doubt that they would bother you. It's the way a few of the points are structured. They're not particularly important, so I haven't proposed them at this stage. We could do. I'm in two minds. They do improve the process a little bit and make it a little bit more straightforward and cost effective for a developer that might have several houses inside the overlay that needs to be dealt with. It doesn't matter too much if there's only 1 or 2. It's when you start to talk about scale, it makes the modelling process a little more efficient and easy. So I could look at those with Kiwi Rail if you like and propose those small changes. I think they'll be quite straightforward.
Thank you. But can I just ask you, so in short, do you think there is justification for having noise controls, mitigation controls on housing within that distance of railway lines in Napier?
Yes.
Because of the level of activity?
Yes, that's right.
And that's all the railway lines in the city? Because I can understand the line out to the port.
Yeah.
But would that apply to the other lines within the jurisdiction?
It certainly does at the moment, and I think yes, based on my understanding of it. But that may be a better question for Kiwi Rail to talk about, and they might have a better idea of the current and future use. It's the future use that's most important, I think, of those lines. And really it comes down to whether or not there's likely to be a regular, if the level of use is low, it comes down to whether or not there's likely to be a regular pass-by at night. If it was only once a month or something like that, it probably wouldn't justify the controls, or if it was only during the day, probably wouldn't. But if it was more frequent and at night and likely to increase or could increase, then I'd support the controls.
Okay. Useful, thank you.
And then the only other point that I just wanted to make was...
Sorry, before you change the topic.
Yeah, sure.
Just a follow-up question on railways.
Sorry, yep.
Thank you. The noise control mitigations that you're putting in, and these are only going to be for new properties rather than requiring anyone to do mitigations to existing dwellings.
Yep.
What is the ask above and beyond the building standards? Is there much?
It depends on how close you are to the road or rail. If you're near the outer edge of the overlay and the noise levels are lower or close to the threshold, generally it doesn't require much at all. On the rooms facing the road or rail, you would need to have the windows closed or be able to close them, and you would need a mechanical ventilation system that can introduce fresh air, or suck air out, which reduces contaminants and CO2 and moisture and these sorts of things, which you normally rely on open windows for. So that's typically a small fan, a silenced fan that's not expensive, and then air conditioning to make sure that the rooms are cool enough in the summer. So, and that's quite typical for a new build anyway. Probably the fan would be the only thing that's a little bit different, but they're not particularly expensive. $1,000 maximum for that fan, depending on the size of the dwelling, but for a small dwelling that would be the cost.
Mm-hmm.
As you move closer to the road or rail, and rail being the key here because it gets quite noisy when you get close, you would need to start looking at the building envelope itself. So now we're talking about more than just closing the windows, we're talking about upgrading the glazing, potentially the facade and the roof. And if you're really close to the rail, you need in the order of around about 35 decibels of attenuation, which is becoming significant. Things like sliding doors are out. You'd have to have a hinged closing door with a compressible rubber seal around the perimeter. You'd absolutely need a double glazing arrangement with reasonably heavy glass, maybe 6mm float on one side with a 12mm airspace and a 6.5mm laminate pane. I know that's getting technical, but that gives you an idea of what's required. It's pretty hefty.
Just to clarify on that double glazing is standard in all new builds now, though, isn't it? But
That's
this
right.
is a special type of double glazing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. It's generally a much wider aluminium section that's required to accommodate the thicker glass and the bigger air gap. And then the aluminium section itself has to be pretty heavy as well. And in some cases, it might be that lightweight facades like a weatherboard facade just wouldn't be workable, and you would need brick veneer, some kind of heavy facade, and probably a relatively fancy internal lining with 1 or 2 layers of jib and what's called resilient rails and a few other things. So yeah, as you get closer to the rail, it does get more complicated, absolutely. Then there's only one other topic really that I've got a point on, and that's in relation to the use of helicopters for agricultural, aviation and construction. You've got quite detailed evidence from Mr. Michel on that. And rather than go into the detail, I think I could summarise the main point that we're trying to get out. I've worked with Mr. Michel quite a lot, including in other processes. I think we understand each other quite well. I understand that he is trying to ensure that agricultural aviation or the use of helicopters for agricultural aviation and construction is essentially exempt from the controls or subject to very liberal controls to allow it to occur. And I support that. What I think needs careful control is the landing areas that those machines will use. If they're landing there on any more than a infrequent or irregular basis. So, in other words, infrequent or irregular use of a piece of land for landing is fine. When it becomes regular or frequent, then it needs to be subject to a more detailed control. And when there is a landing area that is being used for passenger transport and other private uses, I think they need tight control as well, because they are the types of activities that upset people. Typically the very seasonal, very intermittent use of helicopters for things like spraying, frost control, these sorts of things, and construction, maybe lifting an air conditioning unit onto the top of a building or lifting gravel to the top of a hill for a walking track, these sorts of activities happen so infrequently and over such a short period that it's not an issue. So I'm very keen to see that the provisions are clear to allow for the relief that Mr. Michelle is seeking for those regular and frequent activities, but that there's no loopholes in those to allow, say, passenger transport or private use of helicopters to exploit them. That's where I've seen things go awry in the past. Those are all the points I had to make, but happy to answer any questions.
Very helpful, thank you. Any further questions from Mr. Stiles? I am aware a little bit of the time. We were due to finish our reporting officer summaries at 9:50, and I'm aware that we have Kaingora in the wings waiting. Are you able to hang about longer? Okay, cool. Thank you. Unless there's any further questions for Ms. Mills, we'll move on to our next reporting officer.
Yes, that's me. I'll begin with the medium and high density residential zones. I've got 3 residential zones.
So you're starting with medium.
Medium and high density, yes. My name is Lily Lawson. I am employed as an associate planner at Barker & Associates and as a consultant planner to Napier City Council and the reporting officer for the medium and high density residential zones chapters of the PDP. My qualifications include a Bachelor of Urban Planning with honours. I was not involved in the drafting of the medium and high density residential zone chapters, but prepared the Section 42A report for all the matters relating to these provisions. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the medium and high density residential zones represent a significant change in the residential typology provided for within Napier, and in turn a significant change for the community as to how they live in and view Napier. However, it is my opinion that the zones represent the culmination and implementation of 3 Hawke's Bay specific planning documents developed since 2017, which have consistently identified intensification as the most appropriate and preferred means of meeting Napier's increased demands on housing and protecting versatile soils. The medium and high density residential zones have been strategically located in close proximity to transport corridors and existing town centres where accessibility to services and transport is optimised. To achieve the objectives and policies set in relation to the medium and high density zones, the standards provide for heights up to 12 metres and 19.5 metres respectively. Effects on adjacent properties and streetscape amenity are managed through standards such as height in relation to boundary, yards, building coverage, windows to the street, impervious area, and maximum building length. Quality living environments are achieved through standards such as residential outlook space, outdoor living space, and minimum residential unit size. There are approximately 200 submitters on the medium and high density residential zones, raising approximately 500 submission points and 200 further submissions in relation to the zone provisions. Of the submissions, approximately 200 were in opposition, 250 sought amendments, and 45 were in support of the medium and high density residential zone provisions. The number of submitters, submissions in opposition, and submissions in support were similar across the two zones. However, there are a greater number of submissions seeking amendments to the medium density zone compared to those seeking amendments to the high density residential zone. A high number of the submissions were received by residents who were generally opposed to the medium and high density residential zones and sought the deletion of the zone in its entirety or from specific streets or addresses. These submissions will be addressed under the Section 42A for rezoning requests. However, for completeness and because of the general nature of the submissions and the ability for changes to the provisions within the medium and high density residential zones to address or address in part concerns raised, these submissions have formed part of the assessment generally. The concerns raised by residents were summarised in my report, and I've listed there those ones. I addressed these matters in sections 39 to 69 of my Section 42A report, as well as in my consideration of the rules and standards. The remainder of the submissions were categorised into groups with the following interests: development interests, network utility and service stations, education facilities, fire and emergency, and retirement, villaged and aged care. Regarding the submissions raised by residents, while the relief sought was often for the deletion of the zones in its entirety or removal from the zone from certain streets or properties, consideration was given as to whether the concerns raised could be addressed through changes to the provisions and in particular the standards. However, ultimately it was considered that significant changes to the standards would compromise the ability to deliver the outcomes sought by the zone in relation to housing supply and diversity. A number of changes were recommended in response to submissions by parties, and these... Yes, yep. No pre-hearing meetings with submitters have been held. At the time of publishing my opening statement, I listed the evidence that had been received, and since the opening statement was published, I'm aware that evidence has been received by Fire and Emergency, Heavy Haulage Association, Kiwi Rail and Sarah Chambers. And I then just outlined the changes that I've recommended in response to evidence I've received and questions from the panel. So these aren't reflected in my Appendix A, but would be in my officer's reply, and that is the permitted density. As notified, one residential dwelling was permitted in the medium and high density residential zones, and the panel raised this matter in their questions. In my report, I did express concern over the notified rule, however, ultimately did not recommend changes to the notified provision enabling council to obtain financial contributions through requiring a resource consent where dwellings exceeded one. Napier City Council has subsequently sought legal advice, which confirmed that provided there is a rule requiring contributions for permitted activities, contributions can be collected before a boarding consent is issued. So I'm therefore comfortable that that rule doesn't need to act as a trigger, and that R1 in the medium and high density residential zones can be increased from 1 to 3, and that this would be more effective and efficient at achieving the objectives of the two zones. I've also considered the references to design guidelines, and this is an approach that's been formed with the other reporting officers as well. So we acknowledge the concerns raised by the submitters and the panel, and we haven't worked out the details yet, but consider it more appropriate to reference the key elements of the design guide in the assessment criteria as opposed to referencing the design guide itself. This approach is consistent with what Hastings District Council does, and the design guide is then used to illustrate good practice. At my paragraph 22, I outline those matters which I consider to be key areas of contention. I guess putting aside the residents' concerns who are seeking deletion of the zone, which will be considered as part of the rezoning requests. So those are the maximum building length, which has been pursued by Kāinga Ora and TW Property. Opposition to the recommended fencing standards by TW Property. The standard for outdoor living space pursued by TW Property, and the outlook space pursued by TW Property, seeking amendments to require that to be 4 metres instead of the notified 6. And the following additional matters have been pursued by parties through evidence since the publishing of my opening statement. FENS seek a restricted discretionary activity for emergency service facilities within the medium residential zone, and the inclusion of a standard for firefighting water supply. Heavy Haulage Association pursue a 9-month reinstatement period and promote the use of a pre-inspection checklist building condition report. And I note those are that relief is consistent across other residential zones as well. It's not particular to the medium and high density. The setback distance of 5 metres from the railway corridor pursued by Kiwi Rail, and Sarah Chambers seeks a number of revisions and requests for additional responses to submission points. And I just noticed I didn't read out the matters pursued by Vigor Brown Group, which they consider that there's been a misinterpretation of the MPS UD and the impacts of the Vigor Brown Street and the heritage overlay, which has also been considered in the heritage chapter, and the underlying zoning has been considered in the rezoning requests. Just additional matter that's not in my published statement. The evidence put forward by TW Property in their opposition to the changes recommended to the fencing standards. This matter has been discussed with Council's Principal Policy Planner and the Reporting Officer for the General Residential Zone. And I understand that the submitter considers that the changes do not allow for fences to be built 1.8 metres in height for no more than 50% of the site frontage, and 1.2 for the remainder, is 1A2 provided for in the notified provisions. This provision was actually intended to apply to corner sites, allowing one of the road frontages to be 1.8 metres in height, but ensuring the other was 1.2 metres in height. But this was not reflected in how the standard was notified. And so I understand that the submitter considers that this is quite a significant departure from the notified provisions, and their concern is that the recommended changes don't allow for a private front yard. And I just want to indicate that I acknowledge that there may be circumstances where the changes they seek are appropriate within the medium and high density residential zones, and we'll consider this as part of my section 42A reply. I'm able to respond to any questions from the panel, and I'm also able to provide an updated opening statement to reflect the changes that I've spoken to.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Wilson. Any questions? Commissioner Van Oorthuizen.
Just one, in terms of this, the Hastings District Council's design guide and your intention there to incorporate key elements from that, would that be in a new standard or what?
No, that would be in the assessment criteria.
Would that be done by variation? Because obviously interested parties would want to have a say on that, which elements you're incorporating and what the actual words are that hasn't been notified
Yes.
yet. So would that be a variation?
Because the design guide at the moment is in the assessment criteria, we're not introducing new matters because the design guide is referenced within the assessment criteria itself. What we're taking is key elements of that rather than referencing the design guide. But Fleur may be able to assist on whether there's a scope issue there.
Yeah, I'm just curious about that because that's a reasonably substantive change to the notified provisions. I imagine a number of submitters would want to have a say on that.
Did you want me to respond to that?
Yes, please, if you could.
Yeah.
Sure. So the design guide sets out a number of key elements to consider when assessing whether the urban design is appropriate. And the intention was to, as Liddy said, instead of referencing the design guide itself, was to draw out those key elements that sit within the design guide and include them as assessment criteria. So the remainder of the design guide establishes a means to achieve those key elements. And so the understanding that was, the concerns that were raised by the submitters, we felt were valid, and that this would be in a way of not referencing that external document, but by actually drawing out those key elements in the design guide itself.
If I remember correctly as
That's not
well,
the issue.
there was a submitter that sought that the key elements be put into the, that was part of their relief. So I will be able to track that down. That's my recollection anyway.
Just a follow-up question. The design guide is incorporated into the plan by reference, so it is part of the plan.
Correct.
Whole thing.
As
So-
an assessment criteria.
So all of the elements and everything in that design guide are technically part of the current
Correct.
proposed plan. Okay.
I think I asked a question, I can't see it here, but did council follow the proper Schedule 1 procedure for incorporating? So it was notified, people had an opportunity to submit onto the design guide, submissions were received, hearings were held?
That's correct.
Okay.
We notified the list of documents to be incorporated by reference alongside the notification of the PDP.
Mm-hmm. And which parties presented submissions or comments on the design guide?
Nobody submitted on the design guide itself. There were just submissions on the PDP relating to referencing the design guide.
No, I meant when you followed the first schedule process for incorporating the design guide by reference into the district plan, who provided comments on that when that was notified? That has to be done separately to the proposed district plan process.
My understanding is we followed the correct process.
Yeah, so who, if anyone, provided comments on that document?
We didn't receive any submissions on that document.
There were no comments received on that document.
So this is distinct from the proposed district plan process. It's the notification
That's
of
correct.
documents to be incorporated by reference, and no one provided comments on that.
That's correct.
Okay.
So just to clarify, because Ms Lawson said that the design guides are outside the district plan process, so I'm a little unclear how that would work. So it's currently part of the proposed district plan is notified. That means if Hastings District decided to change that design guide, you would have to change or at least unincorporate the design guide from the PDP. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So the concerns that were raised through the submissions related to the fact that this design guide was created and I guess held by a separate council, and that we didn't have the same level of control over it as we would have if it was a Napier design guide. My understanding is that they are looking to make some minor changes this year. We would need to, if we did want to reference the design guide itself, we would need to reference the year that it was created, which was 2020. And so if that design guide was to change, then it would no longer reference the most up-to-date version. Hence, our shifting in the way that we think about this and the way that we would incorporate it by pulling the key elements out of that design guide rather than referencing the design guide itself.
Okay, so you would have the elements incorporated into the district plan provisions
And the assessment criteria.
and assessment criteria. What would happen to the incorporation of the design guide into the plan? Would that be
That would
removed?
fall away.
That would fall away. Okay. But it still could be used as an external document for
That's correct.
design assessment. Okay. Any further questions?
Not at this stage.
Just thinking practically, how do we ensure that we're being kind of consistent across the region? Does that include a pathway where we can still use the up-to-date ones if we should agree with Hastings when they update theirs?
Yes, so if we were to retain reference to the design guide, we would need to do a plan change to update reference to the new version. My understanding from discussions with Hastings District Council is that they do not have any intention to change the key elements that sit within that design guide, and that they would, certainly this year, are only looking to update a couple of diagrams that demonstrate how those key elements would be achieved.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
I'll move on to the large lot residential zone now. I won't repeat my name and qualifications. The large lot residential zone applies to a discrete area on the periphery of Napier's residential area where there are significant landscape, ecological, mana whenua values, topographical and or infrastructural constraints to enable suburban scale residential development. The zone, located in Kent Terrace, is a transition between urban and rural areas and is located to the west of the general residential zone and bordered by the rural lifestyle zone to the south and north. The provisions of the zone recognise where constraints as well as the opportunity for the zone to provide a larger lot housing option and maintain the character of the large lot residential zone by managing development within the zone through standards relating to building coverage, landscaped area, impervious area and yars. In total, there were 24 submissions and 2 further submissions, and the majority of these were in relation to the rules within the zone. I've outlined the changes that I've recommended in my paragraph 7. No pre-hearing meetings were held. At the time of publishing my opening statement, Angela McFlynn had submitted evidence, and since the statement was published, evidence has been received by New Zealand Heavy Haulage Association and Fire and Emergency New Zealand. Those matters which have been pursued and where I do not recommend additional changes at this stage but will consider any further discussion is the minor residential dwellings within the large lot. And Ms McFlynn addresses this within her evidence, noting that on the 5th of April, the new national environmental standards under the RMA were indicated to be in place by the end of this year, which will require all councils to permit a granny flat up to 70 metre squares on sites in rural and residential zones without the need to gain a resource consent. The following additional matters have been pursued by parties through evidence since the publishing of my opening statement. Heavy Haulage Association pursue a 9-month reinstatement period and promote the use of pre-inspection checklist building report. Fire and Emergency New Zealand seek a restricted discretionary activity for emergency service facilities within the large lot residential zone and the inclusion of a standard for firefighting water supply. I'm able to respond to any questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? No, I have no questions, thank you, on that topic.
Great. Making up time. I will turn now to the Mission Residential Precinct. Precinct 2 is a residential precinct within the Mission Hills development area. The land use provisions, while generally consistent with the general residential zone, have been tailored to be appropriate for the unique character and identity sought for the residential development within the Mission development area. Such bespoke provisions include the identification of a prominent visual development area, the requirement to screen from view buildings within this area from Church Road, and the tailoring of the assessment criteria to incorporate the design outcomes of the original Plan Change 12, particularly in relation to the street network, subdivision allotment, design and path network. There were 13 submissions, all received by Emerald Hills Joint Venture Limited, who are the owners of the precinct area. At paragraph 7, I outline the changes that I've recommended, and a pre-hearing meeting with Mr. Jury and Ms. Mills was held to discuss the precinct matters generally. While no changes in position were formalised at this meeting, we agreed to continue to talk. And the matters discussed were the 5-metre yard setback required by Standard 3, screening by Rule R2 and Assessment Criteria 1, stating that services will be vested to Council, and the consequential amendments required to Precinct 2 to address submissions made on the subdivision chapter. Since the publishing of my report, the evidence has been received by Mr. Jury, while the additional matters pursued in evidence to those that we discussed at the pre-hearing meeting include the preclusion of notification for subdivision under Rule R3A and the activity status for retirement villages in R5. While no additional pre-hearing meeting has taken place, there is a commitment by both parties that we'll continue to work together with points of agreement or otherwise reflected in my officer's reply. I'm able to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? No, I have no questions on that. Thank you. Who next on the list? Okay. Ms. Hemmings?
Tēnā koutou. My name is Brooke Hemmings, and I'm the author of the General Residential Zone, starting with General Res, and then I'll move to my precincts. General Residential Zone Section 42A report. I'm employed as a graduate policy planner within Napier City Council City Development Team, and my qualifications include a Bachelor of Social Science in Political Science, Education and Public Policy. I have been involved in the proposed district plan since January of 2024, and while I have prepared the Section 42A report for the matters relating to the General Residential Zone, I was not involved in drafting the proposed district plan chapter or the Section 32 report. I have read the submitted evidence in relation to the General Residential Zone chapter, and I'm happy to take questions after my statement. The General Residential Zone is Napier's most common residential zone, typically featuring 1 to 2 storey standalone or attachment homes with landscaped gardens. The provisions aim to enable a range of housing types while maintaining a suburban character, and they promote well-designed, connected neighbourhoods that support community well-being, ensure adequate infrastructure, encourage water-sensitive design, and allow compatible non-residential activities that maintain residential amenity. Moving on to the matters raised in submissions, there were approximately 96 submission points and 54 further submission points received regarding regarding the general residential zone chapter, and among these submissions, the themes included fences, retirement villages, housing supply density and intensification, fire and emergency services, reverse sensitivity issues, schools and community facilities, infrastructure, the design guidelines and architectural controls, which we've touched on already, and miscellaneous. In terms of responses to pre-circulated evidence, there has been pre-circulated submitted evidence and statements that were received from a number of submitters, including Angela McFlynn, TW Property, Kāinga Audit and Sarah Chambers. Since publishing this statement, I am aware that there has been more evidence and I have read this. I am prepared to respond to any questions or matters raised in relation to this information provided, and I do believe in some cases there is scope to make changes and address the concerns, but I do wish to hear from submitters before providing a response as well. There have been matters raised by the panel in advance of this hearing, and these matters have been answered separately to this opening statement and have been attached and circulated as an appendix to this opening statement. The key matters in contention to the general residential zone chapter, these include how the general residential zone chapter relates to how the plan manages housing supply, intensification and amenity within established neighbourhoods. Key issues received in submissions include the appropriateness of fence height and design controls, which Lily has also touched upon, and the need to provide for retirement villages and elderly housing, and the balance between enabling additional housing and maintaining residential character. Concerns were also raised regarding the treatment of non-residential activities such as school and emergency services, the adequacy of infrastructure planning, and how reverse sensitivity effects are managed, particularly adjacent to non-residential or infrastructural uses. These matters have been considered in detail through the assessment of my submissions, and the recommended changes are outlined within Appendix A of the Section 42A report. I have to take questions on this one.
Yes, before I turn to the panel, you say in some cases there's some scope to make changes to address the concerns. Are you
Yes.
able to highlight, but in particular, what areas you may consider changing your recommendations?
Yes, sure thing. That was in regard to the, sorry, I have it listed over here. In regard to the design guidelines in which Lily has referenced as well, I agree with the approach and our ideas in terms of amending the assessment criteria to include those key elements. That was the right word, thank you. And also I've looked into the TW Property submissions on fences, and while I would like to hear a little bit more, I'm open to some of the changes in terms of that, how we notified the chapter in terms of the misunderstanding of the corner sites standards. Sorry, I hope that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where my thoughts are for now. However, yeah, happy to also hear from.
Keep an open mind. Any questions from students? No.
Cool, should I
It's all
move?
right. Before I move on, I'm just keeping an eye on the time frame. So what I propose to do is we will continue and hopefully finish officers by morning tea, and then we'll hear from Kāinga Audit submissions. If the submitters after morning tea, if they don't mind being postponed for like 20, 25 minutes, because we do have two submitters who've fallen away just before lunch, so we'll shuffle things downwards if you don't mind. Okay, there's agreement to that. Okay, thank you for that.
Cool. I won't go and introduce myself again, but I'm now going to address the Precinct 1, Precinct 3 and Precinct 8. Where are we at? While I prepared the Section 42A report for matters relating to Precinct 1, the Harbour Reserve Amenity Precinct, Precinct 3, the Napier Hill Mataruaho Amenity Precinct, and Precinct 8, the Foreshore Commercial Precinct, I was not involved in drafting the proposed district plan chapter or the Section 32 reports. Just a quick overview of these precincts. The Harbour Reserve Amenity Precinct aims to maintain the established character and amenity of the Hardinge Road and Waghorns Street, where the modern residential development complements a consistent pattern of built form. While not protected for heritage value, the precinct supports quality residential environments, allows for appropriate intensification that respects local character and enables non-residential activities that enhance the community well-being without compromising its amenity. The Napier Hill Mataruaho Amenity Precinct seeks to retain the distinct character, amenity and development patterns of Bluff Hill and Hospital Hill. Building on the residential zone provisions, it supports quality residential environments and acknowledges the area's limited capacity for intensification and enables a variety of housing types. The precinct also encourages low-impact design and allows for suitable non-residential activities that enhance the resident well-being while preserving the neighbourhood amenity. And the Foreshore Commercial Precinct enables a limited range of commercial and visitor accommodation facilities suited to its sensitive coastal location in Ahuriri. As an extension of Ahuriri Village, it overlays the local centre zone but additionally seeks to protect the values and surrounding open space and coastal environment. The precinct maintains coastal character while supporting commercial use with controls on height and landscaping to ensure quality design outcomes. The matters raised in submissions for these three, there were two submissions in relation to the Harbour Reserve Amenity Precinct, and these submissions were not contentious relating to fence heights. In total, there were 9 submissions in relation to the Napier Hill Mataruaho Amenity Precinct. Submissions primarily seek greater flexibility for development within the precinct, particularly on larger historically modified sites. Mana Ahuriri Trust seeks recognition of these sites for higher density, comprehensively designed developments and alongside alignment with the MPSUD 2020. By shifting from a focus on character retention to character management, and other submissions raise concerns about the application of precinct provisions to infrastructure, such as rail corridors, and request more flexibility around parking provisions. In terms of the Foreshore Commercial Precinct, there were 2 submissions, and again, these were not considered contentious and were around fence heights. I have recommended some amendments based on these themes. At the time of writing the opening statement, there were no evidence in regards to these, and I'm pretty sure that is still the same. There has been no received evidence on these, and there were some matters raised by the panel in advance of the hearing, and these matters have been answered separately to the opening statement and have been circulated to the panel as an appendix. The key matters of contention were raised by Mana Ahuriri Trust and relate to their request for site-specific provisions within the Mataruaho Amenity Precinct to enable greater development on potential 6 properties in which they have a specific interest in. They seek to shift the planning framework from one that focuses on retaining existing character and amenity values to one that follows a more that allows for more intensive development, including comprehensively designed higher density residential visitor accommodation and retirement village facilities, which includes this includes new rules, standards and policies specific to their sites, in contrast with the broader precinct approach intended to manage the character and development patterns consistently across Napier Hill. While some minor changes have been recommended, such as redefining the objective to reflect maintenance rather than strict retention of character and improving assessment criteria, I have recommended that most of the trust changes have been rejected and accepted in part to then preserve the precinct's integrity and ensure consistent management of character, amenity and infrastructure, as well as traffic effects. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you. Any questions from Ms. Hemmings?
No.
Okay.
Not at this stage.
No, not at this stage. Thank you. Thank you for that.
I am Paulina Wilhelm, the manager of City Development, and I am going to be reading the officer's statement for Jeriel Sajan today, who's unfortunately not being able to be here today. The officer's statement referred to neighborhood center zone, local center zone, large format retail, mixed use, town center, and city center. I am happy to take it as read if the panel would prefer that, because I'm not going to really be able to answer any questions on detail on this report. Letting you know, though, that Jeriel would be looking at the recording for this hearing and would be able to respond to any questions in her officer reply report. So just take it direction of the chair.
Okay, I'm also wary of the time as well. Any key questions at this point in time? No, thanks, that's fine, thank you. And so that brings to an end the officers? Ah, right.
Just one more.
Lincoln, yep.
One short statement.
Okay.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So my name is Fleur Lincoln. I'm the Principal Policy Planner here in this team. And I just prepared a short statement in response to some queries from Ms. Sarah Chambers.
Oh, yes.
So in relation to an email received from Ms. Sarah Chambers dated 15th of April 2025, the Chair has asked officers to respond to her query in relation to her submission points. I can confirm that officers have considered submission points from Ms. Chambers in the various hearing Section 42 reports where relevant to the district plan topic. Officers will continue to address her submission points in relation to these hearing topics that have not yet been heard. As the hearings have been run by topic, not all of her submission points have been addressed to date, and I note that where submissions were considered out of scope or not a district plan matter, these have been noted within the recommendation reports. An additional hearing to be scheduled once the majority of topics have been heard will address any submission points that have not yet been addressed through these topic hearings.
So thank you. Just a question. Just can you confirm that no submission points in Ms. Chambers' submission have been overlooked in any of the Section 42A reports today, other than obviously the ones that yet to be heard topics?
No.
Yeah, I can confirm that we have reviewed all submission points that have been addressed in the different hearing streams.
Mm-hmm.
In the case that some of them have been definition of map submissions, which were not considered on an appropriate hearing stream, they would be wrapped up in the mop-up hearing at the end of this process and will be picked up then. So
Right.
Intentionally, non-submission points have been left out.
Thank you. Any questions on this matter? No? Okay, thank you. Well, on that, I may adjourn for morning tea, and we will resume with Kaingora's two witnesses after that, and hopefully just the Fens and Mana Huriri after that, before lunchtime. Okay, thank you. On that matter, we'll adjourn the hearing until, what time did we say we would resume? 11 o'clock. So thank you. Was reconvened after morning break on the first day. Before us, we now have the first of our submitters for this hearing stream in attendance. We have Ms. Spaniker, the corporate witness for Kaingaora, welcome, and Mr. Lindenberg for planning, thank you, welcome. We have read your pre-circulated evidence, but you may wish to summarise your key points and in particular any responses to what you've heard this morning about changes that are now being recommended. So over to you, Ms. Berniker.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having us. My name's Lizelle Berniker. I'm a Principal Development Planner for Kaingaora and the Housing Delivery Group. I presented at Hearing Stream 2 for the subdivision matters, all by my lonesome, but luckily today I have Matt with me. So what we will do is probably just get Matt to summarise his key points and address any matters, and then I can just fill in terms of a corporate sense of the view as well. So I'll hand over to Matt.
Thank you. There was quite a bit of overlap between your
Yes.
corporate statement
Yeah,
and Mr.
exactly.
Lindenberg's
So we'll-
statement. Yep. Okay, thank you. Mr. Lindenberg.
Morena, council team, and thank you very much for the council officers for the presentation this morning. It's helpful to get a few updates, which we're putting out. So I won't read through anything where evidence taken as read. I'll just speak through a couple of the key, sort of what I think are now the outstanding matters. First point would be the paragraph 5 section of my primary statement around the permitted density matter. It was great to hear Council Officer confirm this morning in relation to the relief sought for the MRZ and the HRZ that the Council have accepted that relief that was sought. The outstanding matter there on density is still the general residential zone. So I did just clarify with the Council team just at the break there that while Council have accepted Kaingaora's relief for the medium density and the high density, they've retained in the general residential zone the just one dwelling as permitted. I continue to think that can easily be changed to 2 dwellings as permitted in that zone for the same reasons set out in my evidence. But also really, I mean, for me the key issue is, well, what is the effect that we're trying to manage and what would be the effect we're concerned about in that zone from enabling 1 up till 2? I think the effects that we're trying to manage are going to be the bulk, the location, the dominance, the effects and amenity effects to adjoining properties. And I really think the key management provisions we have are the development standards and the performance standards in the zone. They are what are going to help manage the adverse effects that might come from enabling that second dwelling on a site, and where those infringements or where those particular standards might be infringed from enabling that second dwelling, Council are easily able to assess any of those effects from those infringements. So I think it's entirely suitable and appropriate to have 2 dwellings permitted in that zone. I think it certainly supports the tenor of the NPSUD and what it's trying to achieve in Tier 1 and Tier 2 locations, and particularly just around housing optionality and typology. You know, if we continue to have general residential zones that continue to provide permitted envelopes that encourage bigger footprint single dwellings as the kind of predominant path of least resistance, we're going to continue to provide into our urban environments one predominant housing type, and that's going to come with one predominant housing price. And that's really what NPSUD is trying to do. It's trying to improve enablement in our urban zones, in our key urban centres, and really try and focus down on the issues that really need to be managed, and acknowledging that planning sometimes is having this impact on affordability. And for me, those density rules is one of those key parts where planning provisions can help with improving housing affordability and housing optionality. On the design guideline standards, that was another point noted this morning by the Council. It was great to see the change that they had picked up there. In terms of the discussion around the Council having a look back at the design guideline to then just sort of see what that might mean for the outcomes that are already articulated in the provisions, we've got the policies in the zones, and we've got the suite of the assessment criteria in the zones. The assessment criteria are actually a pretty good package of assessment criteria, and I think they, in combination with the policies, are giving a good framework for articulating clearly what the outcomes are that the councillors are trying to achieve in these zones. So, you know, my sense is if the council look back and go through the design guideline in detail and then have a look at where they think they might need to change the criteria, they may well get to a place where they think actually the policies and the criteria are really quite clearly articulating the outcomes we want, and we don't need that reference to the design guide in the provisions. It can be a process of how the council really makes the development community aware that that design guideline is there and how that is there as a tool to help developers think about how they construct their designs for their developments to achieve the outcomes that are stated in those policies and in those assessment criteria. Part of the sort of the quality or the good look at that package of assessment criteria is one of the reasons why I've recommended the deletion of that maximum building length standard. So again, looking at the package of provisions, and particularly in that medium density and high density space, particularly actually in the earlier phase where the provisions were only enabling one dwelling permitted in those higher density zones, having a permitted standard with a building length with a maximum for 22 kind of doesn't make sense in terms of, I don't see a lot of single dwellings being built typically in urban areas with vast building length issues that need to be managed. It's very much a matter that is in the higher density multi-unit space. But the key thing I think, and having been involved for many years in the Auckland Unitary Plan process and all the residential provisions that were looked at there, there was a really detailed expert conferencing group and we went through everything, and it started with maybe 20 performance standards in the medium density and high density zones. And we sort of structured it back to the key things you want when you're doing an RDA framework in those multi-unit zones is having standards and performance standards, perhaps a reduced suite that are very much focused on those aspects of design that are likely to create adverse effects external to the site, the height in relation to boundary, the yard setback requirements, often the outlook and the windows to the street, these things that are addressing the public realm effects or the neighbour effects. You know, those are the ones that you need to have a particular focus on. As you get into the other standards, you'll find often there's a whole suite of standards that really relate to internal site effects. They can be daylight, they can be outlook, they can be all manner of others, fences and walls, minimum unit sizes, and building length becomes another one. The minute you're into a multi-unit RDA and you've got a really good package of assessment criteria, that's what you're trying to use to assess these developments to get the right kind of outcomes. Having the standard in and of itself becomes at times a little bit immaterial. You're going to get different size sites. The standard will apply very differently to different size sites. It probably only kicks in as trying to manage a real effect when you're at a 4+ dwelling sort of proposal in any case. But at that point in time, you're, by virtue of the density rule, you're already in a restricted discretionary activity space. So you're already able to assess this effect. So then you're really just looking at, well, do we need all the more standards or rules, or at the point in time that we're accepting that we're able to assess multi-unit development through RDA, it's the outcome that's actually articulated in the assessment criteria, which is the really important thing that is going to drive how the built form outcome looks. So one thing I haven't commented in my evidence, but I did want to just clarify for you today is my evidence has said remove the building length standard and delete the standard. Don't delete the assessment criteria that are in the provisions that relate to the outcome that's trying to be articulated. currently in the zones, it's sort of separated out as its own assessment criteria and says it's a criteria for infringing the standard. That kind of bit could be removed, but I'd really encourage the council team to, and commissioners, if they're looking at those criteria, the actual outcome that's stated in that criteria is a really good outcome, and I'd like to just see that as part of the assessment criteria for those developments in those zones that are 3 or more dwellings. They're automatically going to be triggered to be thinking about breaking up building facades so you don't get long, monotonous frontages, and that is a great outcome. So that it's, for me, it's the articulation of the outcome sought in the criteria that is the key. Other than all those matters there that have been addressed, one of the key things we started with this morning were some of those noise aspects and the railroad issues that are addressed in some of the latter part of my evidence. Section 9 of my evidence just supports council's position on that, the safety setback, which is sought by Kiwi Rail, and my support for council's position of just retaining the setbacks that are already in the plan, which provide, I think, an appropriate distance and room for the kinds of building maintenance activities that Kiwi Rail are trying to address. The other issue is the noise issue and how that is to be addressed. I've been involved in the road noise topic for a number of years now with my friends from Kaingaora, and that's both in the presenting at hearings, but also being involved in numerous appeal proceedings with Kiwi Rail and Waka Kotahi. The actual package of provisions that are in the plan are pretty good and about 85 to 90% aligned with a few packages of provisions that have been agreed in consent orders over recent times between the parties. The key thing I've flagged in my evidence is this: where spatially does the rule and the trigger kick in and apply? It's not currently mapped. The only way we understand the spatial implication of where the rules kick in is through the definition that utilises the 100-metre default distance. From those previous processes I've had involvement in, it becomes apparent that the issue can be modelled. Mr. Stiles touched on this morning the fact that Waka Kotahi have made available at least modelling on a national basis, so that's actually there for us to utilise. We don't have that available as an equivalent on the Kiwi Rail side, but what I have seen through the appeal processes I've been in is that it can be modelled and it can be done. And so the key point of that is that the impact of these provisions is that for any new development, but also for redevelopment of existing dwellings where you're going to be creating new bedrooms and new sensitive spaces, there's a cost to meeting the insulation requirements, right? There's a cost on the developer to address an adverse effect. Where that cost is being placed upon a receiver when they haven't generated the adverse effect, for me, I want to be really certain that the adverse effect actually exists in that location that warrants that landowner needing to make that intervention and make that investment. The problem with the 100-metre default distance is, particularly through urban areas, in other instances and processes where I've seen it modelled, it typically brings it back to probably 20 to 40 metres through your urban environments. So that could be roughly, 20 to 40 versus 100. There's potentially a big swathe of land through urban areas that could be asked to be making an intervention with a cost to address an effect that people aren't really even certain actually exists there. And when it's an effect that they don't create or generate, I really don't think people should be burdened with that additional cost. And from some of these processes of being in where we have been able to model it, then you can really refine it back to where does an adverse effect actually exist as best as we can know and model and understand it, and therefore it's appropriate to have an intervention to address it. So that's why my particular focus there has been on that the default distance versus that whether we model or not approach. And my preference will always be for modelling it when we know it can be done. There's a little bit of additional cost and time in doing it. As far as I am aware, we should be doing this as a national planning standard, so every council across the country doesn't have to go through this, because it can be consistently done right across the country, and it doesn't need to be a council by council process, but we're a wee way away from that, I think, at this point. Those are really the key aspects I wanted to talk to you about this morning, and I can pass over to Ms. Beneke, but also happy to take any questions.
Okay, Ms. Beneke, anything you want to add?
I think really just confirming support of the change to up to 3 dwellings is permitted in medium density and high density residential. That's really encouraging for us at Kaingora. Obviously, we have a very significant land holding here, about 1,500 homes from last count. Again, just reiterating, it would be great to see 2 as permitted in the general residential as well, just for the same reasons as applied to the medium density and high density. I guess the only other things I just wanted to point out is that the minimum lot size for subdivision obviously is going to impact what happens through this, and we had deferred that through hearing stream 2, so that was just something I just wanted to pop up. And again, also the guidelines, we're stoked to hear that that you're considering taking them out of the plan. Wellington PDP, for example, at the moment they became operative last year, and they're really starting to look at a Schedule 1 process to change things in their design guidelines. So that's not even a year old. Just noting that the Napier, the subdivision guidelines are still up for, so I'm not too sure if that will also be something that council will consider of taking it out of the PDP as well, in terms of referencing it. The only other thing really was the notification preclusions for those for the standards. Just noting that through submissions, council had decided to include that public and limited notification was only precluded if all the standards were met. We consider that that could be refined a bit in terms of what could be considered for a preclusion, especially those effects that are, well, standards that have effects internal to a site. So it just gives a bit of incentive really in terms of applying the rule as well. So that was in paragraph 7.1 of my evidence. I think that's really it. In terms of the noise layer and the questions that you asked Mr. Stiles around, you know, if anything changes in terms of land modification or anything like that, another option is to make it a non-statutory layer. We go around the country talking about this around flood layers, flood mapping layers. So it's another option of maybe keeping it out of the plan but referencing it, so that if anything does change significantly, then that can be changed and altered and be dynamic, just like a flood layer would as well. So that is an option of something to consider around that. Yeah, and I think that's really it. So happy to answer any questions as well.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Beneke. Just for your information, the reply report for subdivision just came out on Friday, I think. I don't think it addresses the points you do. It addresses a number of other points that were outstanding from hearing stream 2, but just so that you're aware. Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Commissioner Van Voorthuizen.
Yeah, just in terms of the number of residential units that should be permitted, obviously you've expressed your support for the staff's recommendation to us that it now go from 1 to 3 for the HRZ and MRZ. And in fact, we as the panel members raised some questions about that ourselves. I don't know if you've seen the questions that we put forward to the staff.
No.
Okay. We provided a number of questions to the officers, and those questions are answered. I think that's available on the council's webpage. So that's just for your information. But in terms of the general residential zone, where you're asking for 2 residential units, the rules at the moment, R1 provides for 1 residential unit, R3 commits a minor residential unit, so it kind of allows 2 units already, albeit 1 primary and 1 minor. But my question to you, in terms of district plans that you're familiar with outside of the main urban centres, so I'm not talking about Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, Hamilton, Dunedin, districts like this, can you point us to any examples where 2 primary residential units are a permitted activity?
I think off the
You
top of
would
my
know
head,
others.
New Plymouth is
Yeah.
probably one of them. But I'll have to have a think.
Yeah, if you can identify any that are in a similar context to Napier and direct us or provide us with the actual
Yeah,
rules from those plans. If we were to accept your submission and allow 2 residential primary units per site, would there still, in your view, then be the need to permit a minor residential unit as well? So would it jump it up from 2 to 3?
For me, yes, because they're 2 quite different things. One is really providing for a minor unit on
Yeah.
potentially the same site. The other is really trying to deal with how can we best use the larger sites in that zone to be able to address housing supply and housing affordability issues. And that's why I sort of say, well, if you're getting into the space where you've got maybe a 500 to 700 to 800, that sort of, how are we using that 400 or 500 to 800 part of the site when we know the first dwelling's easily in that first 300 to 400 able to fit. Where you have those larger sites, having confidence in the package of the performance standards and development standards for the zone should be giving council the confidence that any adverse effects of enabling the second dwelling are being managed by how that second dwelling is needing to comply with all those standards.
Yep. And you mentioned there larger lots. That was going to be my next question. Again, if we were to accept the relief you seek, 2 primary residential units, would the rule usefully specifies a minimum lot size where that could be enabled, or would you just see it being carte blanche?
There are still going to be subdivision standards that will then, and typically I always look at it from there's the sort of the blank site subdivision versus the subdivision that
What if there's no subdivision?
goes with land use. So you'd still be identifying as part of the development how you are complying on that site to treat it as 2 houses that are still individually meeting their package of performance standards. It then wouldn't need to be necessarily formally subdivided.
Yeah.
It could be, but it
Yeah.
wouldn't need to be. But it's still how you go about showing that the second dwelling is able to be accommodated within the site area in a way that it can still comply with the standards. And if it can't, then all those adverse effects of those non-compliances are easily able to be assessed. And if council thinks that there's an effect there that goes above and beyond what's anticipated, there is absolutely the ability for notification if necessary.
Okay, so is what you're saying, in the absence of subdivision on a large site, if someone wanted to put 2 residential units there, the other standards like yards, height to boundary, in your view, that's sufficient safeguard?
That's exactly what those standards are there to do. I mean, otherwise you also sit there and you go, so what's the adverse effect of the second dwelling? And often when I sit there and I try and think about that in and of itself, I can't really articulate what the adverse effects would be that wouldn't already be being assessed and addressed through the package of the standards and meeting the outcomes that are asked for through objectives, policies, assessment criteria.
Right.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah,
Just a follow-up
finish
question.
anyway.
So a minor unit is often associated with a principal
The principal
unit on
dwelling.
site. So would 2 units a site mean 2 minor units?
I'd need to look at the very specific wording of the provisions, but effectively a site will be a site if it's developed in a sort of a subdivided sense, and then within each site the provisions apply in terms of the ability for a principal dwelling and a minor. Then I guess I'm trying to think also in my mind of, do you get outcomes typically where we have dwelling, minor dwelling, dwelling, minor dwelling, sort of stacked in a site? It's possible through the framework of provisions. Is it an outcome that typically makes sense when people are developing a new site, redeveloping their existing site? It might be a little more on the fringe, but I think we still have a package of provisions that enables the effects to be considered, and that's the key bit.
I don't think it would, because the rule says 1 minor residential unit
Per site.
Yeah.
It doesn't link it to a primary
No, but I mean,
Sometimes some of the standards do. Sometimes there are standards that go with minor dwellings that can sometimes talk about it needs to have a living space that's accessible to or located from the principal dwelling in la-di-da, but it might not.
Well, why don't you look at that for us and come back with an answer to that question? Once you hit, not now, but look at the provisions in detail and say, is that a fish hook that needs to be dealt with? Oh, sorry, I'd finished. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Questions? Mr. Brown?
Yes, I've got two questions. The first one might be a bit of a layperson's question. Sorry, I'm not a planner. I'm getting a bit confused around residential units and dwellings versus buildings. So, because you can have one building with two dwellings in it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So how does that? What's the definition, I suppose, of a residential unit? Is that two separate buildings that you're discussing here, or?
No, I think a residential unit or dwelling is a unit or a dwelling. And in a multi-unit sense, we'll be typically seeing multiple units in one building structure.
Okay. And so the provision you're looking for is to enable multi-dwelling buildings and two...
In the GRZ and the MRZ, HRZ, it's just where do we draw the permitted line of how many dwellings you get as permitted? So not the buildings, but certainly the dwellings. And you touch on a point for me of when I noted before, what's the adverse effect of the density of enabling that second one?
Mm-hmm.
You could do that entirely within the footprint of an existing dwelling.
Yeah.
You could simply be cutting up your existing large footprint dwelling and deciding you want to make it two dwellings.
Yes.
And I would say to you there'd be no adverse effects of doing that. So actually, multiple units or dwellings within a same structure, again, like it's sort of, so what's the threat or the issue that we're trying to manage by keeping the permitted threshold at one, when the effects that we want to manage are those bulk and location effects, those effects to the neighbours and adjoining properties. And it's the performance standards of the height debate and how that all works that manages that effect.
So what you're saying is the rules as it stands now would prohibit taking one building and splitting it into two dwellings? Or have I got that wrong?
I think it's just one dwelling permitted in the GRZ. Yep. So the minute you wanted a second dwelling, you're kind of in that sort of consent space.
Consent space.
But also for me too, it's that path of least resistance. So if a general residential zone is a large residential zone through an urban area, and often it takes up a good swathe of urban land, you're thinking about how best you want that land utilised, there are going to be numerous opportunities of being able to provide second dwellings on numerous ones of those sites, and just having trust in that good structure of the provisions package that are going to manage those effects is going to enable that land to be best utilised.
And the second one's around the modelling of the noise contours along the railway and state highways. When we've done the modelling around the port and the airport, those boundaries are often quite contentious, but they're of a small scale, so it's kind of manageable from a process perspective. If this is done across all highways across New Zealand, is there risks around how that is managed?
Well, in terms of the data and the model itself, the reality is it's never going to be a submitters or other submitters model, and it's really not going to be the council's model. It's always going to be modelled by the infrastructure providers themselves. So you are trusting on the model they're providing. They'll have all the assumptions that are built into the modelling, and in the processes we've been involved in, you're having those discussions about that. There can always be but what if there are changes here and there to any model? And then I would go to any other effect in a plan that we spatially define, right? And I would say we can have that argument in all those same sort of instances. Where exactly should the airport noise boundary be, the port noise boundary? Others, you can get into it with the natural environment overlays and where exactly should a boundary be for significant ecological areas and others. My bigger picture response to a lot of those, but there could be little nuances in the model that might create a problem, or we might have to change something later. That is a lesser cost or an issue to worry about than potentially, in my view, asking for a response to an adverse effect for a large number of properties that incur a cost that might not actually have to address an effect. I think that is a much bigger risk that needs to be managed than the model issue. The point you raised earlier around vegetation is probably one that I've seen more in the visual models for things like views to landscapes and others when I've been involved in the noise issue. The one that has come up frequently will be, actually there's been a change recently to the state highway here. There's been a new connection and a roundabout, and that's actually created changes in landform. You've built bunds, around some of those new areas, and that has an impact on noise. So you're often asking Wakakotahi, and does that part of the model in that location pick that up because that's recently been done, and you're sort of refining that as you're doing it. There will be those instances. But on the whole, for me, creating that spatial representation of the plan to model and identify exactly where we understand the effect to be. You only need an intervention in a plan to address an adverse effect where you have confidence or knowledge that there's going to be the adverse effect that's there to manage, and it's as simple as that.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of questions, just for clarification more than anything. You heard this morning that the council offers a recommendation in terms of the design guide, the Hastings design guide. What's your view at the moment? What's your position?
My position is, my preference will always be to not have those design guides referenced in the provisions in the policies, assessment criteria. Also knowing that it's not the council's design guide, it's another council's design guide. The minute you refer to the design guide by name in the provisions, council will find themselves in a position in the not too distant future where you might have to do Schedule 1 processes to update and change that, and then I always think it is a tool there. A design guide sits as a tool prepared by a council to enable the community and the development community to understand how they want their outcomes that they express in a district plan to be achieved. It's as simple as make sure our assessment criteria and policies and our planning provisions state those outcomes clearly. Then this design guide can sit over here and we can steer the community and developers to it and say, if you want to see what we're talking about to how this is achieved, here are all your ways and options of doing it. I don't think you need to list the document in the plan to do that.
So you're comfortable with the current position in terms of the recommendations that you heard this morning?
Yes, because that was, as I heard it, in line with the evidence position that I'd put forward.
Okay. And another clarification is around the rail noise issue. You're recommending modelling rather than a blanket default setback.
I would never support a blanket default setback approach, and I will always support a modelled approach.
So if you're the officer recommending on this, what would your recommendation be in regard to the rail corridor, the noise corridor?
Well, my recommendation would generally be that the package of provisions that is being put forward is probably there or thereabouts, but you need certainty that if you're going to apply provisions that are going to have an intervention and a cost, that interventional cost is warranted from a knowledge of an actual adverse effect. And the modelling is the only thing that tells us where we can have confidence the adverse effect actually takes place. So the modelling element is fundamental.
So in the absence of modelling, which we don't have before us, what would your recommendation be?
Well, I would not want to see the provisions go in on a default 100-metre basis.
No. So would you have, because you did refer to an alert layer before, would that be your recommendation, has just simply have an alert layer?
Well, the vibration alert layer, for instance, is really, as I see it, it's sort of a mapped visual representation, almost of an advice note, because for the rail alert layer, there's not rules or provisions in the plan that are tied to it. It's really to let people know that there's this issue here. It's just providing good information to people so people can make better decisions. So I'm quite happy with the way of doing that. Would you do that for the... I mean, I don't want a package of provisions that asks for an intervention where the effect is not well known. If you're not going to map it and take the time to define where the effect is, you shouldn't have a package of provisions asking for an intervention to address an effect. Would there be a role for some kind of alert layer just to sit in the plan to let them know that there's noise issues? You probably wouldn't do that, but could you have provisions in a plan? And as Ms. Benneker had touched on earlier, there are examples across other plans where there are provisions in a plan, but where and how it's mapped sits in council's wider GIS viewer, not, if you like, the district plan mapping viewer. And that is certainly a case that you could see in numerous locations where people have dealt with all the flooding mapping layers that get tied to provisions relating to development, earthworks, etc., in floodplains, flood-prone areas. And that's really that tension between we need to have the best available information possible in terms of that flood modelling and mapping, and it's often being updated by councils regularly, so they like to have that sitting outside the district plan maps so it can be easily amended, best possible information without sort of a cumbersome Schedule 1 process. If you're going to have provisions, you want the maps. I would say I'd typically like to see maps in a district plan if you're going to have provisions in a district plan. We absolutely have examples like the floodplain one, and I think it makes good sense for floodplains and flood maps to sit outside the district plan from that Schedule 1 process update point of view, because to me that's good efficiency in plan making. We know that flooding issue in urban areas is very dynamic. We know it changes. We want to have that ability. Then I'd look at the modelling of the rail and road and I'd go, would it be that dynamic and that changeable that there would be more of a benefit to sit the maps in the district plan viewer or the broader council viewer? It might not be that dynamic and changing a model that it needs to sit in the wider council GIS viewer. I think you'd more likely be able to get a model done for the jurisdiction, have confidence that that's probably 80-90% going to be the modelled outcome for the next 10 years for the life of the plan, and you could put the modelled layer into the plan maps.
Okay, and just to clarify, given that we don't have the modelling information for the rail noise corridor, would your recommendation to be have that layer outside the district plan and still apply through district plan control?
Well, if we don't have it mapped and it's not supported by mapping, then I would challenge why we need the provisions to address an effect that we haven't been shown is necessarily taking place in particular locations. We're just being asked to use a 100-metre buffer.
Okay, and just one final question. Building length. So your recommendation is not to have any standard on building length. And yet I heard you before talk about bulk and location. Isn't building length quite intricately tied into bulk issue?
Absolutely, it is. And that's why I want it retained within the matters of discretion in the assessment criteria for the minute you get to that fourth dwelling, you're in an RDA process and we get to assess it, because it is a multi-unit, much bigger building issue, not a smaller single dwelling, you know, and so it wouldn't even make sense to me having it as a standard in the zones if you were retaining a one dwelling approach. Council aren't, they've gone up to the 3 as permitted. At that point from 4 onwards, I think whatever effect is trying to be managed is already articulated clearly in the assessment criteria that's written well to say this is actually what that standard up there is trying to do. It's trying to get this outcome. So the outcome articulated in the criteria to me is most important. The standard, I think.
Well, as Commissioner Brown alluded to, if you were to have 2 units as a permitted activity on a general residential site, you could have 2 undetached, you know, joint single building, would not building length be a potentially relevant issue?
You'd still have the assessment criteria that's talking about the
assessment
issue.
criteria apply for consent processes, not for...
Oh, for two, I think at 22 metres or something, the two dwelling is probably not really creating an issue. I think that's going to be that's a long
It is.
building structure for two dwellings. So thinking through it, I'm kind of like, I think it really only kicks in actually at the fourth dwelling as a real effect more generally that you're trying to manage. Because that's where you're getting to, you know, thinking of those longer sites, and you're not going to get the height, but they're trying to use it, and they're effectively going to do a long block of flats, for instance, you know, terraces down a site. For those first two or three, the building length issue, I don't think is going to be an issue that you need the standard to address. From that fourth one on, that's where the effect is, but at that point, you're in a full restricted discretionary consent where we're wanting to assess your design, and that's a key aspect of the design we want to assess, and we've got the outcome articulated in the assessment criteria. That's the best way to address it.
Okay, but often district plan controls are stopgap, or not stopgap, that's not right, fallback positions in case an overly long building, for instance.
Yep.
That someone decided to put, say if it's two dwellings on a single site, and then not detached, that length building thing might be triggered. They might have a very long, skinny building on a site. Because often most sites are long and skinny internally.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think, is that I still am thinking it's only getting to that long, skinny problem, not for the first or the second. You know, the third or the fourth, you're having the argument about when does it really kick in that we want to make sure it's a standard versus actually we've got what we're needing to assess in the assessment matters.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions?
Yeah, just one for the officers. Just in terms of the issue that Councillor Brown raised, the definition of residential unit means a building or part of a building that is used for a residential activity exclusively by one household. The GRZ chapter refers to dwellings in three places, but dwellings is not a defined term in the district plan. So can the officers in reply come back to us on whether or not the word dwelling should be replaced with a residential unit wherever it occurs in the district plan? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very helpful. Thank you. Now, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, Mr. Palmer, and we have Craig Sharman online. Thank you. Thank you very much for your patience. As you know, hearings often either run late or run early, so it's really on time. So thank you very much for your flexibility. Much appreciated.
That's good. Thank you, sir. Can I just check, in the room hear me okay?
It's a bit quiet, so we're just checking whether we can raise the volume. Yeah, if you just keep talking and we can play with the volume.
Thank you, sir. I'll try and talk loudly as well. So, yes,
good.
so, great, okay. So my name is Craig Sharman. I'm a planner with Becker. I've been a planner in local government for 10 years and then as a consultant for 15 years, and I'm familiar with the Code of Conduct and agree to comply with that. And I've represented Fire and Emergency New Zealand since 2017 in various district plan processes and plan change processes. And I'm familiar with the Fire and Emergency New Zealand submission and the more recent correspondence. And can I just check with the panel that there's a letter dated 7 May of 2025, which is a written statement on behalf of Fire and Emergency New Zealand.
Yes, I have that we have it in front of us, yes. I was just going to note that that's signed off by your colleague, Alec Duncan. Can I just ask your role in this letter, just to clarify for the record?
Yes, so I'm representing Fire and Emergency New Zealand in at this hearing, and Alec Duncan is my colleague, and so she consulted me in terms of the letter, and I reviewed it, so I'm familiar with the contents of it and agree with it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
And in the room with you is Bob Palmer. So Bob Palmer is an officer of Fire and Emergency New Zealand, and so Bob will answer questions and just in terms of operational matters and local context.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm not presenting detailed evidence as such, but what I will do is just amplify a couple of points through the 7 May letter. And so broadly, Fire and Emergency New Zealand are fairly comfortable with where this is all landing. A challenge for Fire and Emergency New Zealand, just in terms of the way the process is structured, is that we find ourselves dealing with Fire and Emergency New Zealand submission points and then 42A officer recommendations across a whole lot of the hearing reports, and that's just the nature of the fact that we're talking to citywide matters that then play out slightly differently in each of the zones and in the various chapters. So so just by way of preamble, we just asked, I suppose, that we'll be doing our best to kind of talk across the various reports and the chapters. So we'll be fairly brief this morning. We've got 2 submission points that we will speak to, and so that's in regarding firefighting, water supply, and just the legislative instruments that exist and the relief sought from Fire and Emergency, and then secondly, emergency service facilities themselves, which by facilities we're effectively meaning fire stations. So if I can direct you to the letter, and then at the bottom of the first page, I obviously won't read it. I'd like to take it as read, but we will just sort of amplify some of the points.
Okay, thank you.
So we had a really useful meeting with Fleur Lincoln, who is a Napier City Council planner back in March, and we really appreciated that opportunity to just sort of talk through just some of the kind of the implications, I suppose, for the points that Fire and Emergency New Zealand was trying to make, and we had a useful backwards and forwards, which I understand has then kind of informed the 42A recommendations for this hearing stream. So on page 2 of the letter, there's a series of bullet points under the heading Section 42A recommendations. So what we did in those discussions, and what we'll do here just briefly this morning, is there's a whole set of different development and subdivision scenarios here. And in the second bullet point on page 2, whilst the 42A authors are correct, I suppose Fire and Emergency's primary concern does lie with large industrial and commercial premises, and also to rural locations where there's no reticulated council water supply network. But that's not the entirety of the concern. So there are a plethora of kind of redevelopment situations that can be residential, and so your previous submitter and speakers were kind of useful as context for that. So now that we're in the world of medium density residential standards, residential intensification potentially as permitted activities or with quite minimal resource consenting processes are being promulgated by landowners and developers. And so the challenge then for Fire and Emergency New Zealand is that they don't necessarily get any input into any kind of resource consenting process or have any awareness necessarily of some of these developments. And so the original relief sought, which is the red text at the top of page 2, is really about trying to fill some gaps in a sense. So as you'll know, there's a code of practice, which amongst a whole lot of other topics does have provisions on firefighting water supply. And there are Building Act requirements, but I suppose the reason Fire and Emergency seek relief on this matter in different district plans and plan changes is because there will be situations where either there is no resource consent process at all. The code of practice, therefore, might not really be applied by council officers, and the only process might be a Building Act, building consent application. And the Building Act is by its nature site by site, property by property, and firefighting water supply doesn't always come up, and there isn't always a subdivision here. So with intensification, there's not always a subdivision process. Sometimes it's either a land use resource consent, if there's a resource consent at all, or it might be a permitted activity and simply be a building consent process. So I'm just seeking to explain, I suppose, why Fire and Emergency New Zealand pursue this particular point, and we were trying to address it really as a citywide matter rather than as a zone-by-zone matter, because whilst the characteristics are a little different within the different zones, effectively the issue is the same. The issue is around protecting life and property, and just ensuring that a landowner or a developer, and certainly council officers, and discharging their various responsibilities either under the Building Act or under the district plan, are cognizant and thinking about firefighting water supply as an issue, and liaising with the development engineers at council. And we would also hope are liaising with Fire and Emergency New Zealand. And so the zone aspect here is that obviously in commercial and industrial zones, there's a difference of the scale of building and the type of building that we're talking about. Obviously, that's quite different than a residential situation. And then within the residential zones themselves, we have different levels of intensity of the development. And so there are all sorts of, I suppose, issues emerging nationally where a single detached dwelling is being removed off a site and being replaced by perhaps a terrace of residential units or an apartment building. There's not necessarily a subdivision process involved in that process, and depending on some factors, it may be a permitted activity. So this is all summarised really on the bottom of page 2 and then on page 3. So the Building Act is an important tool in terms of process and in terms of firefighting water supply. It's not the perfect tool. There are situations where, particularly in residential situations, where actually the Building Act requirements are not that strong. And then in terms of the code of practice, whilst it does all the right things and it has strong provisions in it, Fire and Emergency, you can't always have confidence that the code of practice is being applied, especially in a situation where there's perhaps no subdivision involved. So at the end of all of that discussion, what Fire and Emergency are putting forward and what I'm recommending then is really or a district-wide provision that's we would not want that to be a trigger for resource consent, but we would want it to be a provision that that applications are having to apply for quite broadly in terms of land use and subdivision. And so the text for that really is at the top of page 2. I understand from the discussion with Ms. Lincoln that there's some issues with the text, and I accept that, and particularly when it starts off with the words "all new developments," which then becomes a kind of a problematic provision. But we think there's a useful discussion to be had in terms of a district-wide firefighting water supply provision that applies both in a subdivision and in a land use or rather a development context. And so we accept there's some limitations here in terms of the district plan. If something's a permitted activity, well, then we are going to have to rely on the code of practice and the Building Act processes. Bob, do you want to speak to that before we move on to the facilities?
I think if you could cover off the facilities as well, and then we'll just open it up to questions and discussion.
Okay, sir. Thank you. So then on page 3 of the same letter, so we've just tried to set out in the table kind of where the 42A recommendations have kind of landed and what the original relief was from Fire and Emergency. So I certainly accept that characteristics of the different zones can be very, very different, and and I can understand the 42A recommendations in terms of the different activity status being recommended for the different zones. So in the bullet points at the bottom of page 3 and then on page 4, so there's a level of comfort here from Fire and Emergency New Zealand. I think just to explain, when Fire and Emergency considers the need for either redeveloping an existing fire station or constructing a brand new one, there's a locational element to that, and that is around response times and really positioning a fire station in a location that then enables response times to meet the government's expectations for those. And so the locational aspect is the initial and the main driver for Fire and Emergency New Zealand in terms of a site selection process that they would go through rather than a district plan zoning. And obviously as part of site selection, suitability of the zone and suitability of the surroundings is important. But I suppose it's difficult for Fire and Emergency to look at this as a zone by zone issue and have entirely different activity statuses for one zone compared to the next, when if you put yourself in the shoes of Fire and Emergency New Zealand, where there's an identified need for a new fire station, then those response times and the location of having to locate the fire station in a location that enables the response times to be met, that's actually the primary kind of consideration in terms of meeting the community's need. So I'm supportive, as per the letter, just looking then on page 4. I mean, the main point of contention really is around some of the residential zones and the non-complying activity status for general residential and large lot and medium density residential zone. So fire stations by their nature, as I said, have a strong locational driver for why they are where they are. In terms of effects, they're actually relatively passive kind of land uses, really, in terms of kind of long periods of inactivity, and then obviously in an emergency situation, they're suddenly a hive of activity. So, and Bob can talk to how that all works to the extent that you're interested to know more. But so in general, restricted discretionary activity status, I consider as a suitable activity status. It enables council to apply matters of discretion. It enables a notification decision. If effects are considered more than minor, it enables a consent to be refused consent. So a non-complying activity status, as per the 42A recommendations, is really sending a strong discourage signal to Fire and Emergency New Zealand in terms of the suitability. And yet there's no particular kind of benefit of doing so. I think a restricted discretionary activity status is a suitable activity status in terms of it enables an assessment. We've sought to provide some matters of discretion, which is in that final paragraph of page 4, and there could be a conversation if that was something the panel wished to explore. So that's all I had. Obviously happy to work through questions, but it might be helpful just to enable Bob just to fill in any gaps that he wishes to, if that's okay, sir.
Okay, yes, I was going to turn to Mr. Palmer to see if he wanted to contribute.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Bob Palmer. I'm Senior Advisor, Risk Reduction in Hawke's Bay. I haven't got much to add, just rather than, and I've spoken with Fleur and that over the last couple of months, and we sort of discussed the fact that we like to be included in early dialogue when it comes to developments, and so we can have an input and basically guide people in regard to firefighting water supplies. We sort of align our firefighting water supplies with the building code in a way where buildings are built for allowing people to escape safely, for us to enter and effect rescues and carry out firefighting duties, and also to protect exposures and other buildings. So we need water really quickly when it comes to that sort of thing. So we don't want to have to, in reticulated areas in particular, have to run long lengths of hoses that takes us away from but affecting rescues and protecting exposures. So we want to make sure we have immediate supplies. So that's really, and as far as firefighting, facilities, as far as buildings that concern, spoken with my managers and that, and they don't see anything within the next 10 years of building new fire stations or training facilities. We've just upgraded both stations, both major stations in Hawke's Bay, so in particular Napier one. So it's going to be staying there for a little while yet until a tsunami takes it out, I suppose. But yeah, that's me.
Mr. Palmer, any questions?
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about that. So the Napier Fire Station in Taradale Road, that's in the general residential zone. Is that the only fire station within the Napier district currently?
No, we have Taradale, which is volunteer station, and Bayview, which is north, both volunteer stations.
There is a table as well. So table 1 is attached to the submission, and it has details of the fire stations, and it shows 4, Bob. Hopefully that's correct. It shows Bayview, Hawke's Bay Country Volunteer.
Yes,
Fire
sorry,
Brigade.
I did miss those. There is the country, backcountry, I think it's called, which is out past the airport. And then we have Hiratonga, but that's part of the Hastings fire station, so that's away from here.
Thanks.
Kia ora, thank you. Just trying to, with the relief that you've sought around all new developments that can connected to a public reticulated water supply, can you just sort of talk me through, I'm trying to get my head around I suppose the practicalities of that, whether it needs the dwelling to be connected or it just needs to have access. Don't you use the hydrants on the road are what's used, not the house's water supply, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. So when it comes to firefighting water supplies, we use the hydrants on the road. So it's really got nothing to do with the water in the house itself or in the dwelling or building. So, but we need access from the street. There are situations where you'll get, and it's becoming more apparent now with infill type housing, where buildings are getting built further from the road where the hydrants are. So that brings the building code into operation where we have building hydrants where we feed water to those, and then we can take hoses off that to fight fire. So, but we need those within, and it's 135 metres of the nearest hydrant, so we're able to utilise those.
Right.
Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does, because you raised a concern around if buildings are developed without the need for a resource consent, then you might not be triggered. But I was trying to work out what the risk was and if there was any mitigation. I think you covered that.
Yeah, look, in reticulated areas, we're pretty much covered. It's just that when we start having like smaller subdivisions are built, so we're picking up areas of land behind, the normal residential area now, and we're getting more houses built on those areas. We need to be able to have firefighting water supplies in those. Otherwise, we're going way beyond our 135 metres that we need to have access.
Would it be fair to say it's more of an issue in your more semi-rural and larger lot?
Water supplies are a major issue in our semi-rural and rural areas where there is no reticulated supply. So we really want to work with the developers and builders and that to make sure there is firefighting water supplies there. So every situation is different, so we approach it differently. We try to work pragmatically in those situations. There are a lot of places where you will never meet the code of practice, so we try and reach an agreement, if you like. So at least we have some form of water supply for firefighting, solely for firefighting.
Okay, just a question, Mr. Sharman, really for you. That sort of universal standard that's on top of page 2, that would be intended as a permitted activity standard in an ideal world across all zones in the Napier City plan. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, so that was really the drafting intent was that would act as a performance standard and be irrespective of zone, except obviously perhaps rural to urban may be different, but that was the drafting intent.
Okay.
So by its nature, it's broad and I think a little problematic for that reason. But hopefully you can understand the intent is to ensure that firefighting water supply is something that is being considered through a consenting process.
So, well, that gets to the question, yeah. So if it was a permitted activity standard, it would have to be fairly certain in how it would apply, how it would be read and applied. So I read it with those lenses on. So firstly, it talks about all new developments. Is it clear what a development is? Across the board, is that an additional alteration to a building, for instance?
Yeah, so to answer that was the discussion point with Fleur Lincoln as well, is that I think with the definitions that exist in the Napier plan, that a development is something much broader than actually fire and emergency would want it to be. So I agree, there's a problematic element there. And
well, the other problematic element that I see is, in terms of a permitted activity standard, is the next clause 2 talks about where an additional level of service is required. How would you determine? Is there some standards or something that says what an additional level of service is required beyond basic service?
That's right, because point 1 in that provision is really a yes or no about reticulation or not. I think the real rub here, though, is not so much whether a property is connected, it's whether there's adequate capacity in the local water supply network, which I accept as a kind of a technical judgment rather than a black or white judgment. And so, and actually the code of practice. Now talking about the New Zealand Fire Service Code of Practice for Firefighting Water Supply is itself written as a discretionary code of practice with several kind of avenues of compliance. So I really cannot recommend to the panel that the red text wording and kind of in its current drafting that was in a submission that I wasn't personally involved with back in December of 2023. But we're certainly trying to bring the issue to the table.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions from
Just in terms of that last point, if you can't recommend the red text wording to us, we actually would appreciate precise wording from you that you think overcomes the issues that have been discussed. Are you able to do that?
We can do that. It doesn't really work in the format of the plan, or at least in the way the plan hearings have been done, because we've been treated really as a zone by zone kind of topic when in fact we would want to deal with this once in the plan as a citywide matter. But the answer is yes.
Yeah, well, I think the more information we have in front of us, the better. So if you're willing to do that, that would be appreciated.
Yes, I can. Okay.
Thank you.
No further questions? Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Thank you, Mr. Sharman.
Okay. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your time, Pat.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to thank them for their patience, but we have come up to the table. Representatives for Mana Ahuriri. I understand Mr. Gardner-Hopkins can't attend today. So
That's correct, sir.
Holder, Mr. Kay.
Sir, I'll do it. Present my evidence.
Yeah.
Mr. Kay is a senior consultant with my firm, and he's maybe involved in later submissions and evidence, so it just makes for to ensure continuity going forward.
Right,
Given
so
Mr.
it's here on a
Stickney.
listening basis, really.
Correct, yes, yes.
So we have your pre-circulated evidence here, thank you. Take that as read. If you'd like to talk to the main points or any matters arising, particularly from the officers' opening statements.
Yes, so firstly, obviously, apologies on behalf of Mr. Hopkins, Gardner Hopkins. Something's cropped up this morning, so he's unable to attend. And I understand that Mr. Falconer isn't available either in terms of online, but is available to answer any questions post this hearing. And obviously, my evidence picks up on the matter after the earlier work of Mr. Stickney. But having said that, my evidence addresses that this is my evidence, and I'm familiar with the submission as made going forward. Sorry, I'll just get this together. So, in summary, my evidence looks at, considers the local centre zone and the mixed-use zone provisions in the proposed Napier District Plan. And my evidence is that I believe they require amendments to enable appropriate development, to ensure some consistency with the RMA and the NPSUD. In particular, the objectives and policies, in my opinion, the current provisions are unclear and vague and need some redrafting for usability and policy alignment. My evidence is particularly concerned with the restricted discretionary activity status for all buildings. In my opinion, it's overly restrictive when the zone standards are met. I had some concern, and the submission obviously does, around the 25 square metre threshold for additions. I see that as unreasonably low and not necessarily effects-based. Of particular concern was the need for resource consent for compliant at-grade car parking, which is a concern in itself. And my evidence touches on the assessment criteria and the blanket reference to all objectives and policies or the use of all objectives and policies for minor infringements as being inefficient and unjustified. And in terms of the mixed-use zone, again, we would seek some clarity, or my evidence touches on the need for some clarity around some of the provisions and the issues and objectives. The building threshold of 400 square metre gross floor area limits for permitted buildings has been quite arbitrary and low, given the large sites in those mixed-use zones. It touches on the need to perhaps look at increasing the size of permitted hospitality from 150 to 250. The visitor accommodation, we support the recommendation to reduce the status from discretionary to restricted discretionary beyond 5 guests, but perhaps interpolating there, I'd sort of suggest that 5 is still perhaps low, because that's sort of just like a normal household size. The other issue, or the other matter looked at in particular, was the minimum unit sizes. I understand that in paragraphs 94 to 96 of my evidence, I understand that there perhaps been some agreement to reduction in other zones, so just for consistency, this should be considered here. And again, assessment criteria just repeats the concern in the local centre zones that blanket objectives and policies requirements lead to perhaps disproportionate assessments. Again, the RMA requires that plans should be effects-based, efficient and measurable, and the NPSUD, that provision should remove unnecessary barriers, enable intensification and mixed-use form. So, yeah, basically in conclusion, we're just looking for enhanced clarity, remove unnecessary regulatory burdens and promote sustainable management and urban growth. And so that's looking at those activity statuses, larger thresholds, more targeted assessment criteria and deletion of arbitrary controls. So that's it in a nutshell, really. I'm happy to answer questions and go further on it. Also happy to take some, if the panel feels it necessary, to take written questions or things to be addressed at later streams, because some of these things will carry over into streams 5, 6 and 6A, where we intend to provide more comprehensive evidence and submissions. If that helps clarify things further.
Okay, thank you. Just to clarify too, our preference is to address the zone provisions at the hearing, addressing those zone provisions. It was only sort of almost contingency in terms of Mana Ahuri's position in terms of expert advice that we've kind of given leave to address zone provisions in relation to specific rezoning requests.
Yes.
So, but ideally, we hear zone provisions at the hearing.
Yes.
So, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Holder?
Yeah, just a couple of questions. Just at your paragraph 30, you say 100 square metre threshold would better reflect additions of scale. What evidence is that based on?
No specific evidence. Again, it's a figure perhaps when you're looking at the size of buildings that are permitted that you know, it's I guess a larger increase, but again, it could be larger than 100. So there's no specific evidence for that.
Paragraph 52. And you're saying the relief sought there is insert targeted assessment criteria provisions. And normally when we receive planning evidence, the planner provides the precise wording that they're asking us to consider. Are you able to do that?
I can do that. I did start looking at those, yes. So in the local area zone, I've made some recommended changes here, but I just need to have another review on those and really wanted to hear what other people had perhaps before we finalise those, but that's available to you.
Okay, so we can see some wording come through at some stage?
Yes.
Same question arises at your paragraph 57, refinement of the MUZ introduction issues and objectives wording. Are we going to see precise wording from Mana Ahuri?
Happy to provide those, yes.
Yeah. Just at your 64, you're asking for the deletion of MUZ R1A. Was that the deletion of the whole rule or just part of the rule? Because if the whole rule was deleted, then I think it would default to a non-complying activity under MUZ R17 if there was no MRZ Rule 1A at all.
It will be parts of that rule. So there's some clarification around that. I just need to try and get that in front of me. Sorry, I'm just going between papers. Don't have those provisions. I can clarify that. I'm happy to do that.
On that as well.
Don't seem to have that in front of me.
Same issue at your para 104. You're asking for insert targeted assessment criteria. Again, if you're able to work up some precise wording for us.
Yes, can do that.
And just got two more questions. At your paragraph 130, you talk about the MPS on urban development. And you say that policy 6C says the words you have in quotation marks, but that's not what policy 6C says at all.
Okay.
So what's the basis for your evidence there?
The quotation mark should not be there in terms of that policy. So I need to review that, sir. I don't know.
So if the quotation marks, so what are you asking us to do then in terms of the evidence?
Again, so that's to, I guess, in terms of that policy, rather than a direct quotation, it should be that the plan change obviously needs to be more flexible and remove unnecessary restrictions around things such as car parking, etc., where you require a consent, where it appears nonsensical, I guess, to require car parking, to require consents and the like. Similarly, building sizes, where there's no special reasons for those.
All right, so what do you want us to do with paragraph 130? Just delete it or what?
I think you should delete that, sir, and I've referred to that earlier on. It makes sense.
Okay, and it's because we're under the heading of the MPSUD. If we delete 130, then the evidence from you is that the district plan must actively remove unnecessary regulatory barriers like low GFA caps and blanket triggers. So which provisions in the MPSUD provide us with that direction?
So I've covered those off in around 94. So again, the clarification that will be coming through on things like the MPSUD. So yeah.
That's not what we're talking about here. I'm asking you specific questions about your evidence on the MPSUD. So where in the MPSUD are there provisions that would direct us as decision makers to actively remove unnecessary regulatory barriers like low GFA caps and blanket trip triggers?
Well, the MPS is looking for greater intensity on sites, facilitate more development.
I guess what I'm asking you for is your advice to us as a planner on what specific provisions in the MPSUD do that. Rather than a general discussion of your view of them, can you refer us to particular policy provisions?
I don't have them in front of me. I can grab that and do that if that's...
Either now or come back to us on that?
Yes, I'll come back to you on that. Yeah. I wouldn't have made the statement otherwise. So.
Yeah. Now, the same questions relate to your evidence under Policy 5, the first paragraph 132 and quotation marks. That's not what Policy 5 says at all. So the same discussion. Should we be deleting 132 as well? Policy 5 relates to...
Yes, you should, insofar it's not a direct quote, sir.
Yeah. So again, if you could come back to us in terms of the homework that you're going to do for us.
Yes.
Where you think, in terms of your paragraph 133, where in the MPSUD is that directive to streamline and enable development, given that that's your words? I mean, your evidence to us is that the MPSUD does that. So again, if you could just highlight the specific provisions that you think do that.
Yes, happy to do that.
Yeah. And just to the officers, in terms of the homework we've asked Mr. Holder to provide to us, in terms of when you might be doing a reply report, when would you need that homework to be with you by? Like, are we talking 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks?
Yeah, it would be ideal 2 weeks.
2 weeks. Mr. Holder, can you do the homework we've asked you to do within a 2-week time frame?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That was all.
Just a couple of minor ones. The thorny issue of the local local centres, zone around paragraph 26 onwards. You were talking about allowing new buildings as a permitted activity. So there's a consent requirement for new buildings in the zone. I'm just thinking, to playing devil's advocate, the local centre zones are usually surrounded by residential properties, and I was just thinking, your 100-metre threshold for some uses could allow quite a large sort of activity in that zone, which would not address sort of the effects of that activity on the residential area in terms of noisiness. Say, for instance, if it's a new restaurant or pub or something like that. Yes. So I'm just trying to think how that zone would address those sorts of issues. If you had one of those activities, any one of those activities, a permitted activity, commercial, entertainment, etc., as a permitted activity, but no threshold or trigger to look at the sort of issues on the wider neighbourhood around it, how would they be addressed? And this may be something you want to come back to us as part of your response to.
Yeah, happy to come back on that. It would make sense.
Okay. And the only other question I had, you refer to the mixed-use zone as a commercial zone, and I mean, technically you're correct in terms of how it's categorised or whatever, and the planning standards and the district plan, but it is a mixed use, and it is meant to be a sort of integrated residential and commercial neighbourhood. So with a strong that, I'm just wondering how that relates to your requested relief, because
what paragraph is that?
Paragraph 62. Sorry. You're talking about the requirement of the plan to have an urban design assessment of new development at odds with the commercial character of the MUZ and the scale. So mixed use zones that I've seen elsewhere in the country address that sort of internal relationship between commercial and residential through a consent process, looking at how it fits together in a sort of quality environment sense. Are you saying there's no real need to do that?
Well, they're often they're done by other means, like controls of performance standards of the plan, etc. I mean, in a mixed-use zone, there's got to be a different level of amenity expectation to, say, a general residential zone or what might be in an industrial zone or a commercial zone. So, I guess my point there is that the objectives and policies and the rule framework must accept that there will be some level of amenity potentially lost through those. So, yeah, as I say, the 400 square metre building remains arbitrarily stable. We've got it's a wise use of that resource to be able to use it for those potential uses, and if you can control them through specific district plan standards, such as yards or site coverage or building heights, then the design aspects probably, I mean, where do you bring it at? It becomes an issue as to how far that goes in terms of assessing the activities, but the expectation from the objectives and policies perhaps should be that there is a different level of amenity expected through this zone. It is mixed use. There will be competing needs.
Okay, thank you. No more questions from me. Further questions? Oh, no. Thank you, Mr. Holder. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. And Sarah, just before I go live, obviously I think it's appropriate to thank Nicola North on the accommodation she's made in getting these matters moved about. It's often pretty thankless task, and
No,
we do appreciate it. So thank you.
as we do too, so thank you for that. Mate. Thank you. So just turning to the schedule. Right. So that concludes our morning session. Says Ms. McKinnon and Ms. Clayton are not attending the hearing today. So we will adjourn for a lunch break and resume at 1:30 when we'll hear from the New Zealand Agricultural Aviation Association and the Helicopter Association too. So thank you everybody, and the hearing is adjourned till 1:30. Thank you.